All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week number 7 for MPA 610. So we are very quickly approaching the end of our time together. So thank you first off for your multimedia assignments. I have gone through and watched all those videos, and I've spent the past 2 to 3 days working on those, and I have returned some feedback to you. They were all excellent. I thought that the strength of many of the videos was not just the creation of a realistic task force, but really the discussion of the different partnerships that would be used in implementing this task force. And I was very happy to see the amount of variety in the participants in the task forces. So I saw a lot of public-private partnerships, public nonprofit partnerships, partnerships across all three sectors. And obviously, for some of these wicked policy problems that we're dealing with these task forces, such as things like homelessness problem, you really do need kind of that all hands on deck type of an approach. And so most people had that in their presentations. I really do appreciate that. I also appreciated the variety of revenue sources. One of the problems we sometimes run into, especially in this budget climate, is when we are funding a new task force or any type of new organization, and we do that with existing revenue that's coming out of an existing organization's budget. Sometimes that can be a little bit difficult in that obviously the organizations, even though they're participating in the task force, they may not want to give that money up from their budgets. They may look to other organizations to provide more than they're providing. And so sometimes you get in those revenue turf wars, for lack of a better term. And so I think the more you can add variety into your revenue sources, I think the better for the task force, especially a new organization like what everyone was creating in their presentation. And so it was good to see that a lot of people talk not just about money from coming from the budgets of the existing organizations, but also that you rely upon revenue from grants and from other sources as well. And so I think, John Mikesell, who's one of these the very well-known public budgeting and finance theorists, tells us that the best way for any organization, whether new or old, to weather fiscal stress is by having great variety in terms of their revenue portfolio. And so I saw a lot of that in the presentations, which was very good. The quality of the presentations was very good. I thought that they would all fare well if being presented to a board of supervisors or a city council or a governing board. So I was very happy with the presentation. So thank you very much for putting in so much work and effort into creating the presentations. And thank you for the creativity as well in coming up with these new task forces. A lot of them looked at things like homelessness and those types of wicked policy problems, but there are some original and some innovative ones as well. And I do appreciate that creativity. So this is all to say that the grades on the multimedia assignment were all very high, which is fine with me. I have no problems with that. But I think they were all excellent. I think all the grades were in the A range. And so thank you for all the work and the effort you put into that assignment. So with that being said, that assignment is now behind us in the rearview mirror. And looking forward over the rest of the class, which is not a whole lot of time because the class technically ends on Friday, October 18th, which is next Friday. You still have the two Canvas essays. You have Canvas essay number 7. Canvas essay number 7 will leverage some of the information we're going to talk about here tonight, especially looking at the management of human resources as one of the primary functions of public administration. And it will take that information, then in that Canvas essay, you'll just be talking about some of the trends and changes that we have seen in terms of the way in which we manage human resources, kind of moving from the management of public personnel to the management of human resources. And back when I was in a graduate program, all those many, many decades ago, the class that I took on the management of human resources was called Public Personnel Management. And when I became a faculty member, my very first year as a faculty member, I was charged with teaching the personnel management course. And so I then put in the curricular change to change the name of the course from personnel management to management of human resources. And I think that's really kind of shows us the trend that we have been going through over the past several years in managing human resources. So that's Canvas essay number 7. The next week you have Canvas essay number 8, and Canvas essay number 8 should be a pretty easy one for you to do because all you're doing in that essay is you're just going to share the task force that you created in your multimedia presentation. So it just affords you the opportunity to share that task force with everyone else in the class. So you've already got that work done. It's just a matter of distilling it into, a couple of paragraphs to then use as Canvas essay number 8. Next week is kind of odd because, like I said, the course ends on October 18th. So for your post on Canvas essay number 8, your initial post must be done no later than next Thursday, and then your 2 responses will have to be done by Friday, the 18th, because that's our last official day of our term together. Then finally, you have your final assessment. We went through that final assessment last week, and I took you through all the scenarios, so you should have a pretty good sense of what's on that final assessment. Again, parsimony, conciseness is important. Be as parsimonious as you can in answering those questions related to the scenarios. A couple of paragraphs, 1 or 2 paragraphs will certainly be enough to suffice. And then that final assessment is due by midnight on Friday, October 18th. And then October 18th, that's the end of this course. That's the end of our term together. And then you can move onward and upward to your other courses or whatever you are doing after October 18th. But, these courses, these 8-week courses do tend to go by relatively quickly. But the more of them you take, the more you'll get very familiar with the format and get much more comfortable with the format. But so far, so good. It seems like everyone's comfortable with the format. Everyone's doing really well in the class. And so I've been very happy with everyone's performance. So where we are now is where we left off last week is we talked a bit about leading and managing of organizations and that as a function of contemporary public administration. And now this week we're going to continue talking about the functions of public administration by talking about the management of human resources and the management of fiscal resources. And then what we'll do is if we get through all that information tonight and we still have some time left, then what I would like to do is the material that we would normally cover next Monday, since as it was mentioned, it's Indigenous Peoples Day. I would like to, if we can, get to that information tonight. And I think we can probably do that because that information is relatively short. It's just talking about some of the contemporary challenges for public administration, things like telework, managing diversity, those types of issues. And so I think we can probably talk about that near the end of class tonight. If we get through all that information, wrap everything up then tonight, then we will not have to have class next week in observance of that holiday. And then you can just take next week to work on your Canvas essay number 8 and your the final assessment. And so that is our ultimate goal. So we will see how that goal, if we can achieve that goal, I think we probably can. It may mean that we won't do breakout groups tonight. We'll kind of play it by ear, but I think if we have to cut the breakout group assignment tonight, I don't think that's really going to affect us very much and have a negative impact on us. For the final assessment, once we finish our discussion of the management of human resources and management of fiscal resources, that then covers all the information that is covered on that final assessment. And so that will then wrap up all the information that we cover on that assignment. Okay. All righty. Let's go ahead and get into our discussion of the management of human resources. So again, how this all fits in, I just want to make sure that everything kind of links together and it kind of provides you with a good overview of the contemporary field of public administration. This fits in with our discussion in terms of the functions of public administration, what we do as contemporary public administrators. We know, as we talked about last week, that we are managing and leading our organizations. We spend a lot of time managing and leading our public organizations as a primary function of public administration. But then we also spend a lot of our time and effort and our mental bandwidth, if you will, in terms of managing human resources. We know that in a typical public budget, about 85 to 90% of that budget will be the management of human resources, salaries and benefits, and all those resources we put toward managing the people within our organizations. So let's talk a bit about that. And before we actually get into the discrete functions of how we manage human resources, let's talk a bit about the background and where our contemporary approach to managing human resources came from. Now, we've talked at length in the past about the distinction between public and private sectors. And in that discussion, we talked about one of the primary distinctions, the types of employees that we work with. So in the private sector, we are dealing with at-will employees. And so we're dealing with employees who are getting their jobs at the will, the discretion of the organization, and then they maintain their jobs again at the will, the discretion of the organization. We know that for the most part in the public sector, we're oftentimes dealing with career civil servants. And dealing with those career civil servants means that those people are getting their jobs based upon merit, knowledge, skills, and abilities, and they maintain their jobs based upon their performance. So, two completely different worlds when we were talking about the personnel who work in the private versus the public sector. But as we know, we have not always had a career civil service type of an arrangement in our public bureaucracy. And we know it took us a while to get to that point of having this career civil service. At the founding of the nation, the late 1700s, running up into the 1820s, the way in which we hired people to work in public administration was based upon who they were. And we looked at who the person was, we looked at their standing in society, their social standing, did they go to the best academic institutions? Were they from recognized families? So we are looking at people to hire them based upon these people were considered to be the quote unquote gentlemen of the era. And obviously, it's gentlemen because we're talking about the late 1700s and the early 1800s. So we were hiring essentially white males from the most prestigious family backgrounds to work in the federal bureaucracy. The reason for that is also pretty clear, that we had to reassure the public that this new government was not going anywhere, that this new government would be around for a while. We'll wake up tomorrow morning, and this may not be quite as concrete as it may have been a few decades ago, but we wake up tomorrow morning and we expect that there will be a national government. And we expect that there will be federal departments and agencies and a White House and a Congress and the Supreme Court. We just expect that today. That obviously was not expected in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. We were a fledgling nation. In the early 1800s, we were at war with Britain. We had the War of 1812, and so we had British troops who were burning the capital. So there's a lot of concern about the longevity of this new government. And so the idea was if we hired these people who were the quote unquote gentlemen in society, that would reassure the public about the legitimacy of this new national government. And that's the primary reason why we had this era of gentlemen in terms of our personnel management beginning in the late 1700s and running up until 1824. Now, the question about why does it kind of start to end in 1824? If any of you are American history buffs, then you are aware of the presidential election of 1824 that came to be known as the corrupt bargain. And in 1824's presidential election, we had multiple candidates that were running for the presidency. The three most prominent candidates were John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. Well, when you have multiple candidates running for the presidency, it makes it much more difficult for any one candidate to win a majority of the Electoral College. So in 1824, we had Andrew Jackson, who won more popular votes than any other candidate, and who also won more Electoral College votes than any other candidate as well. The problem was that Andrew Jackson did not win a majority of electoral votes. So based upon our understanding and reading of the Constitution, we know that what happens is if no one wins a majority in the Electoral College, then the selection of president shifts into the House of Representatives. So if no one has a majority of electors, it goes in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives then selects the president. And the way in which the House selects the president is each congressional delegation gets one vote, irrespective of the size of that delegation. So you can have a large delegation like we have here in California, or a very small delegation like you have in Wyoming, and each of those states would end up getting one vote for their delegation in the selection of president. So when it gets shifted into the House of Representatives, Henry Clay, who had been Speaker of the House and was a very prominent member of the House of Representatives, he was able to kind of cut this deal with John Quincy Adams, whereby if he, through his House support behind John Quincy Adams, got his congressional delegation to support John Quincy Adams, then John Quincy Adams would reward him with a cabinet position. It's kind of this quid pro quo type of situation. So sure enough, once Clay got his delegations to support John Quincy Adams, that was then enough congressional delegations to then elect John Quincy Adams as president. And then once John Quincy Adams became president, he then appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State. That's the reason why it came to be known as the corrupt bargain. Well, obviously, that was looked down upon by a lot of people in society, especially Andrew Jackson. And so 4 years later, when Jackson ran again for the presidency against John Quincy Adams, he made sure to get a majority of not only the popular vote, but also the Electoral College vote. And Jackson in 1828 was able to get an overwhelming majority in the Electoral College, enough to certainly be elected as president. When Andrew Jackson comes into the White House in 1828, he brings in with him a different approach to how we hire people to work in the federal bureaucracy. Instead of hiring people based upon their social standing, we then migrated into the system known as the era of spoils, sometimes called the era of patronage. So the era of spoils, the era of patronage, we didn't hire people based upon who they were like we did in the era of gentlemen, but rather now we're hiring people based upon essentially who they know. Did they support the winning political party? Did they support the winning political candidate? And it's an old adage, to the victor go the spoils. And so the winning candidate, the winning political party, then had the ability to dole out these government jobs to their supporters. And I think when we talked about accountability and ethics in public administration, we talked about George Washington Plunkett and his experience in the political machine of Tammany Hall. As part of Plunkett's recollections, he provides advice to young, at that time, men who wanted to get government jobs. And he advised them, don't waste your time filling your head with what he called college rot. So if instead of going to college and filling your heads with college rot, instead you should get out there and start rounding up votes and learn how to get a candidate elected, because that's how you got your job in the bureaucracy. Your candidate who you help get elected would then provide you with those types of government jobs. So from the Andrew Jackson administration all the way up until the early 1880s, our approach was kind of this era of patronage, this era of spoils. It's not based upon who you are or what you know. It's now based upon who you know. And did you support the winning candidate or winning political party? Now, what we saw throughout the 1800s is that we had a lot of people who were getting jobs in public administration who were not necessarily qualified for those jobs. Rounding up votes and getting a candidate elected, that's not the same skill set as managing a policy, a program, or a public organization. It's like I always like to say, the skill set it takes to get elected is not the same skill set it takes to effectively govern. There may be some overlap there, but they're not the exact same skill set. So because of that, we end up with a lot of corruption. We end up with a lot of malfeasance and misfeasance and maladministration and a lack of efficiency and effectiveness. And those problems with the era of spoils became more and more pronounced with each passing decade. So much so that as we got into the post-Civil War era and into the 1870s, at the local level, we had the creation of all these municipal leagues. And these municipal leagues at the local level were all created for the purpose of trying to bring more effectiveness and efficiency into local government and to try and root out corruption and inefficiencies. Well, that started to percolate its way up into the national level. So much so that the gentleman you see on the screen, Representative Pendleton, actually wrote a piece of legislation that would replace the era of spoils with a new era, an era of merit, where we would hire people based upon their merit, their knowledge, skills, and abilities, as opposed to their partisan leanings and affiliations. The problem for Pendleton is that he really didn't have this triggering event. He really didn't have this galvanizing event that would open up a policy window that would provide him with congressional support to pass his Pendleton Act. That triggering event didn't occur until 1881 with the assassination of President Garfield. So President Garfield, who won the election of 1880 and started serving in office in 1881, was assassinated by a man named Charles J. Guiteau. And if you know about the story of the Garfield assassination, what had happened is Charles J. Guiteau had written a few political speeches for Garfield when Garfield was running for the presidency. There's no evidence anywhere that Garfield ever used any of Guiteau's speeches, that he ever read any of Guiteau's speeches, or that he even knew who Charles J. Guiteau was. But Guiteau, in kind of his irrational type of perspective, thought, well, I wrote these speeches. I helped Garfield get elected to the presidency. It's the era of spoils, after all, so therefore he should reward me with a high-profile position. And for Charles Guiteau, the high-profile position that he wanted to be awarded with was ambassador to France. Well, needless to say, once Garfield assumes office, he did not reward Guiteau as ambassador to France, did not reward Guiteau with any position. So Guiteau thought if he assassinated Garfield, Garfield's vice president, Chester Arthur, was a big believer in the spoils system. He was a big partisan, a big believer in this whole to the victor go the spoils. So Guiteau felt if he assassinated Garfield, that would then mean Arthur would become president, and Arthur, in his gratitude, would then provide a position to Charles J. Guiteau. So Guiteau assassinates Garfield. Instead of Guiteau getting a position as ambassador to France, what ended up happening to Guiteau is that he was executed, and he was executed as an assassin of a U.S. president. But that was a galvanizing event. That was a triggering event that really created a lot of public outrage, so much so that it kind of pushed public pressure, put public pressure on Congress to then allow Pendleton to introduce his Pendleton Act into Congress. And the Pendleton Act then got approved by Congress and signed by the president in 1883. The 1883 Pendleton Act ushers in our third era of public employment, known as the era of merit. So here under the Pendleton Act, we are hiring people based upon their merit, their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And as we read the Woodrow Wilson article a couple of weeks ago, we know that Wilson talked to us about how we adopted the British civil service system. Because remember, when Wilson wrote that article, it was 1887. It was 4 years after the adoption of the Pendleton Act and the beginning of the era of merit. So Wilson, in his article, tells us that we adopted the British civil service system, but we made some changes to it to make it better fit our unique American political culture. And some of those changes were things such as the implementation of merit-based examinations, the allowing of anyone to take these examinations. So making these examinations open examinations as opposed to closed examinations. So now we provide these examinations, people sit for these examinations, and these examinations will then show us which applicants have the knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to be able to do the job. Also, the Pendleton Act tried to insulate public employees at the national level from the influence of politics. So not only did you get your job based upon merit, but you kept your job based upon merit as well. You could not be dismissed because you supported the quote unquote wrong political candidate or the wrong political party. You kept your job based upon how well you were performing in that position. So we're trying to kind of divorce politics administration here in terms of protecting civil servants from political influence. So here is where we get our American civil service system. The problem was post 1883 into the early to mid 1900s. We were protecting public administrators from the influence of politics, but we were not limiting them from participating in politics. So they had all these political protections, but people were still using their public office, their public time, and their public resources to engage in campaigning, to engage in politicking, to support specific candidates and specific political parties. As a result of that, then we get this thing called the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act in 1939 required that public administrators would refrain from engaging in political activities while they were doing their public administration work. You could not use your resources of your office, the time when you were spending in that office, your public position. You could not use any of those public resources for political gain. So we saw this Hatch Act at the national level, and this Hatch Act at the national level then trickles down among the states, and all these states start to adopt their little Hatch Acts. One good example of a manifestation of a little Hatch Act is the Political Reform Act from 1974 here in the state of California that really does limit the political activities that public administrators can engage in while they are on the job. So now we're not just protecting administrators from politics, but we are also requiring them to avoid politics while they're doing the work of the people. So fast forward then into the 1970s. From 1883, the passage and the adoption of this Pendleton Act, until the late 1970s, in addition to the Pendleton Act, we had Congress tinkering around with civil service. And so every few years, Congress would pass another superseding law that would, in one way or another, one fashion or another, affect civil service. And so they'd add on additional rules and regulations and limitations on what public administrators could and could not do, so that when we get into the 1970s, there was widespread confusion across the entire national bureaucracy about what public administrators could and could not do in their public positions. So there is a consensus that came around the issue of we need to clarify a lot of these ambiguities that were caused by all these laws that were passed subsequent to the Pendleton Act. So kind of straighten them all out, come up with a new piece of legislation that will really clearly lay out for administrators exactly what they can and cannot do. And so that took the form of this thing called the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978. So in the Carter administration, we got the passage of the Civil Service Reform Act. The purpose of the Civil Service Reform Act was, again, to try and sort out this myriad of all these different rules and regulations to make it clearer for administrators to understand how their merit principles were being protected. So the Civil Service Reform Act created 5 new, we want to call them organizations, we can call them organizations, that would help safeguard and improve the civil service system. So the first one there on the screen, the OPM, is the Office of Personnel Management, which we still have with us today. The idea behind the Office of Personnel Management is that it would serve as the central clearinghouse for all the hiring that would occur in the federal government. So we had all these examinations that were being provided to applicants that then had to be devised, they had to be disseminated, they had to be scored. Once people took those exams, then you had to figure out who met the requirements, who did not meet the requirements, who scored the best, who did not score the best. There are a lot of moving parts here. So the Office of Personnel Management was then charged with taking over the control of all the hiring across the federal bureaucracy. It was kind of the central clearinghouse for public sector hiring in the federal bureaucracy. So OPM was charged with creating examinations, with administering examinations, scoring those examinations, putting together eligibility lists. And so typically what OPM would do is the top 3 or top 5 scores on an examination would be placed upon an eligibility list. Then when the agency wanted to interview people for that position, they would have to interview people who were on that eligibility list. And so it's known as a rule of three or a rule of five. Take your top three or your top five scores, make an eligibility list, and that's what the agency would then use to hire off of. OPM in the late 1970s had a very centralizing approach to hiring in the federal bureaucracy. Now, in subsequent years, we have loosened up on that centralization. So we become much more decentralized in how we hire at the federal level. We're not quite as examination focused today as we were back in the late 1970s. When we do use examinations, those examinations are more under the control of agencies than necessarily OPM. Where OPM is really effective today is in their ability to centralize the hiring process in terms of putting forth position descriptions, position vacancy announcements, those types of things. And so OPM has a lot of great templates that agencies can use whenever they want to put out a position vacancy announcement. They can rely upon OPM for that. But since 1978, OPM's approach has become much more decentralized as opposed to being centralized as it was in 1978. But here's this creation of this kind of overhead management agency to be the central clearinghouse for hiring in the federal bureaucracy. Then we created another organization known as the MSPB, which is the Merit System Protection Board. The Merit Systems Protection Board. And the purpose of the Merit Systems Protection Board was just what its name sounded like, to protect the merit system. So if you were a federal employee and you felt that your merit principles were being violated, that you felt that you were being demoted, or you were being terminated or disciplined based upon something other than merit, something other than your performance, you could file a claim with the Merit Systems Protection Board. The Merit System Protection Board was then kind of a quasi-investigatory body that would then go out there and investigate your claim. They would collect information, they would hold a hearing on your claim, and they would then render a decision. So if your merit principles were being violated according to the MSPB, they could then issue sanctions against that agency. So they could say, this person needs to be reinstated to their previous position, and they need to be reinstated with back pay. They can provide all those types of sanctions and all those types of things to make a person whole if their merit principles have been violated. So the Merit System Protection Board is where an employee would go if they feel that their merit principles were being violated. Within the Merit System Protection Board, the Civil Service Reform Act then also created an organization called the OSC, the Office of Special Counsel. The Office of Special Counsel was created within the Merit System Protection Board to do a similar type of function as the Merit System Protection Board did, but it would do it for whistleblowers. And we talked a lot about whistleblowers. We mentioned the OSC when we talked about accountability a few weeks ago. But the OSC, a whistleblower, if they saw someone else's merit principles being violated, they could take their case to the Office of Special Counsel. Office of Special Counsel would then investigate that claim, would then render a decision, and would then be able to issue sanctions against that agency. But this is if you saw someone else's merit principles being violated, you would go to the OSC. If it was your principles being violated, you would go to the Merit Systems Protection Board. Now, the problem with the OSC is when it was created within the Merit Systems Protection Board, it didn't have its own staff and it did not have its own budget. It was just a small part of the Merit System Protection Board. We realized with the Whistleblowers Act that, again, we talked about a few weeks ago, that we needed to make the OSC its own independent authority agency. So we pulled the OSC out of the Merit Systems Protection Board. We gave the OSC its own staff. We gave the OSC its own budget so it could deal with the massive backlog of cases that it was facing as a result of not having its own staff or its own budget. Then the fourth thing that was created was this FLRA, the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And the Federal Labor Relations Authority is kind of the counterweight to the National Labor Relations Board. The National Labor Relations Board deals with private sector organizations. The Federal Labor Relations Authority deals with public organizations and primarily deals with public collective bargaining. So, in the collective bargaining process between an employee union bargaining unit and management, if there are some claims of unfair labor practices. And so, one example, we'll talk more about unionization in a couple minutes, but an example of unfair labor practice is something like what's called regressive bargaining. And so if you have these two parties that go to the collective bargaining table for negotiations, and you'll have management that says, we are going to initially offer, our initial offer is a 5% raise. And then the union comes back and says, we're going to counter with a 7% raise. And then management says, no, we're going to counter with a 3% raise. And they have regressed from their initial proposal. That's called regressive bargaining. That would be an unfair labor practice. If an agency does not allow employees to unionize, to form a bargaining unit and form a union in that organization, that could be considered to be an unfair labor practice. If management refuses to bargain on an issue that's within the permissive scope of bargaining, that could be an unfair labor practice. So those types of unfair labor practices, those claims will then go to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The FLRA will then make those determinations about whether or not that's an unfair labor practice and can then issue sanctions against either the bargaining unit or the management agency, depending upon who was the one who actually engaged in this unfair labor practice. Now, the FLRA was created in 1978. It had a very high profile case it had to deal with very early on in the Reagan administration. And early on in the Reagan administration, we had this air traffic controllers strike. So we had air traffic controllers who were threatening to go on strike. President Reagan said, this is a public safety issue. If you go on strike, I will fire you and I'll replace you with new people to fill those air traffic controller positions. The Federal Air Traffic Controllers Union decided to go on strike anyway, and so President Reagan then fired those air traffic controllers who went on strike and then hired new people to replace them. The Air Traffic Controllers Union said that's an unfair labor practice. We have the right to go on strike. It's part of the collective bargaining process, and so they then took their claim to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The FLRA sided with the Reagan administration, saying, yes, indeed, this is a serious public safety issue. So therefore, we're going to side with the Reagan administration. He had the ability to replace the striking air traffic controllers. What that ended up doing is it kind of had a negative impact on the trust between federal employee unions and the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And for many years after that, public employee unions said there's no reason to go to the Federal Labor Relations Authority because they're just going to side with the administration. And so there's kind of a PR issue that the Federal Labor Relations Authority had been struggling with for many years after that air traffic controller strike. But that's the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Here in California, the equivalent to that is what we call PERB, the Public Employee Relations Board, PERB, PERB. So if you have unfair labor practices going on here in the state of California, those can be brought to PERB, and PERB will then kind of follow a similar process that FLRA does at the federal level to then determine whether or not that truly is an unfair labor practice. PERB here in California is very overloaded in terms of their number of cases. So sometimes it takes them a while to investigate a claim of unfair labor practices. Sometimes by the time the investigation is done, the issue is almost moot, but that's PERB. That's here in California. The kind of the if you want to say the correlation to the Federal Labor Relations Authority at the national level. Then we also have this thing created known as the Senior Executive Service, or the SES. So what we had at the federal level, and we still have today, is we have this position classification system that's known as the General Schedule. The General Schedule consists of all these different levels and all these different pay grades for all the positions in the federal bureaucracy. The General Schedule back before 1978 started at what we called a GS1 position. That was the lowest level position, and would go up to a GS18. A GS-18 would be the highest career civil service position in a federal agency or a department. So these are the management, the leadership that are just below the political appointees. As we know, federal agencies and departments, the heads of those agencies and departments are political appointees. So they are appointed by the president, and in some cases, depends on the position, are also then subject to Senate confirmation. But those are political appointees who are leading those agencies and departments. Then right below them were the GS-18s, and those were career civil servants. So GS-1 through 18 was this position classification system known as the general schedule. That's the reason why it's called a GS position. It's a general schedule position. What we realize is that there was a disconnect between the political appointees at the top of our federal agencies and departments and the majority of people, the 99% of the people who work in that department who were career civil servants. Political appointees were there to carry out the policy goals and objectives of the president. So they had one agenda they were working from. Career civil servants probably don't care a whole lot about the presidential agenda. They care about running the organization as effectively and efficiently as possible. So if a political appointee comes in who wants to completely change the organization pursuant to presidential aspirations, if you're a career civil servant, you'll say, I'm here for a career. This political appointee is probably there for 18, 20, 24 months, and they're going to be gone. I'm just going to wait them out because I'm here forever. And so you have this disconnect between political appointees and the career civil service. So the idea here at the senior executive service is we will shave off the top three levels in the general schedule, GS 16, 17, and 18 employees, these top career civil servants, and we will put them in the senior executive service. When they become members of the senior executive service, they give up some of their career civil service protections. So they no longer have the ironclad protections that everyone else in the career civil service will have. Their future in the organization is more based upon their performance and the performance of the organization as opposed to being a career civil servant. In exchange for giving up their career civil service protections, they will then get some perks. The one perk that they would get would be bonus pay. So if the organization performs better, then they'll get paid for performance. Another thing that they will get, another benefit they will get, is they'll get more flexibility in terms of moving from one federal organization to another federal organization. So you can make those lateral changes from the Department of Agriculture to the Department of, at that time, Health and Education and Welfare, what used to be known as HUE before it became HHS. So you could make those types of lateral shifts across different agencies and organizations. So we try to incentivize people at GS 16, 17, 18 levels to then become part of the senior executive service. The idea behind the senior executive service is a good one. It makes sense. It's going to bridge this gap between political appointees and career civil servants. The problem was in the execution. The problem in the execution is the Congress promised all this bonus pay, but Congress never delivered on those promises. So all these senior executive service members who gave up their career civil service protections never got the bonus pay that they were supposed to get in exchange for it. You think about in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, we were running continued budget deficits, and that's something we're familiar with today. But then it was kind of a novel idea. We were only about 10, 12 years into running consecutive budget deficits. When you're running these budget deficits, it means that you don't have a whole lot of money to share. So Congress kept saying year after year, we don't have the money to compensate these senior executive service members with their pay for performance, their bonus pay. So it led to high rates of dissatisfaction among senior executive service members. Even today, if you would ask a senior executive service member, would you recommend to a younger employee that they join the senior executive service? Usually about 70 to 75% of SESers will say no, that they would not recommend it to a younger employee. But today, what we have now is we have a general schedule because of this change that runs from GS1 through GS15 positions. So that's our current position classification system at the federal level. Pay is then associated with what pay band you're in terms of not only your general schedule level, like say, for instance, you go into the federal bureaucracy, you don't have a lot of work experience, but you have the MPA degree. That would probably place you at about a GS 11, maybe a GS 12 position. But then the longer you are in that position, then you have your steps that you can move up. So after a year, you move up a step and then move up a step and move up a step. And so as you move up those steps, then you'll get more compensation as well. It's that basic stepping column system that we're all familiar with as public servants. And then on top of this GS1 through GS15 career civil service system, this general schedule, on top of that, we now have this executive service made up of the senior executive service members. They are referred to as the ES, the executive service. And ES runs from ES1 through ES5 positions. So you can move up in the senior executive service as well. There is also a senior executive service training academy that the federal government offers. So if you're at a GS 13, 14, or 15 level and you're interested in joining the senior executive service someday, in order to qualify to join the senior executive service, you will need to complete the senior executive service academy to get into one of those ES1 through ES5 positions. So the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 was a whole-scale change to the way in which we did career civil service at the federal level. It provided more protections for people to protect their merit principles and protect their merit protections. It provided this kind of bridge between the career civil service and political appointees with this executive service. It created an organization that would monitor and control negotiations and collective bargaining at the federal level as well. It's also important to note the Federal Labor Relations Authority, I forgot to mention, it pertains to pretty much all public employees except for employees of the U.S. Postal Service. U.S. Postal Service employees are still under the auspices of the National Labor Relations Board. And the reason for that is that the U.S. Postal Service is a government corporation. So as a government corporation, it shares some of the same characteristics as private companies, and so therefore it's under the control of the National Labor Relations Board. So that's kind of our modern system of career civil service. Now, our modern system of career civil service has some advantages and it also has some disadvantages. Obvious advantage to it is that we are hiring people based upon merit principles, and so therefore we at least ostensibly will have more efficiency and more effectiveness in how jobs are being done. We'll have hopefully less corruption because of the ability of whistleblowers through the Whistleblowers Protection Act to be able to blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. As a career civil servant, you know that you have this more stable type of career that you can count on. So sometimes you make that exchange that you'll get paid less money than you might make in the private sector, but you'll have more career stability in the public sector. So we've got a lot of these advantages of career civil service, but we know that there are some disadvantages as well. One of the main disadvantages of the career civil service system is that we have a lot of civil service regulations that managers need to adhere to when they are managing their personnel. Because there are so many of these regulations, and then overlaid upon top of these regulations, you then have collective bargaining agreement provisions. It has made the management of human resources extremely complex in the public sector. So much so that now a lot of agencies have centralized the human resource management function within offices of human resources. So instead of leaving it to line managers to do this human resource management, a lot of these functions have been migrated into an office of human resources. So a lot more centralization into those human resource offices. But in terms of our system of career civil service today, we kind of have a hybrid system whereby the vast majority of our public employees are career civil servants, but then we still have our agencies and organizations that are led by these political appointees. The senior executive service, although it has helped, has still not completely bridged that gap. And so sometimes you'll see a president or a governor appoint a political appointee to an office and hope that that person will then do something like dismantle that agency from the inside out. I think we made mention of the Reagan administration. And Reagan had appointed a Secretary of Education whose job it was to go into the Department of Education and to kind of tear it down from the inside. The Reagan administration wanted to get rid of, at this time, this newly formed Department of Education. So that was the goal of this appointee as they went into the Department of Education. That was not the goal of the rest of the employees in the Department of Education. Obviously, they had a vested interest in seeing the department continue and thrive into the future. And interestingly, what had happened with the Department of Education, the reason why it's still around, is that the career civil servants were kind of able to co-opt the opinions of the political appointee of the secretary. And so the secretary then started to buy into the Department of Agriculture, started to buy into its mission and its functions, and actually work to not only maintain it, but to grow its budget and to grow the functions of the Department of Education, completely to the consternation of President Reagan. So we kind of have this hybrid system of political appointees and career civil servants. Now we know even in this system of career civil service, we have seen this trajectory, and we saw this as we went through the evolution of the public administration literature, where this trajectory has really taken us from the classical school of managing organizations and people to the schools of human relations and human resources, where we are putting a lot more thought and a lot more time and energy into helping develop our employees as resources as opposed to just managing them as replaceable cogs in the machinery. Hence the reason why we now teach human resource management as opposed to teaching personnel management. Now, that doesn't mean that you are not going to find MPA programs around the country that still have personnel management courses in their core curriculum. I do these NASPA site visits, and every few years I still see programs that have personnel management courses. But our focus in the public sector is much more a focus on human resource management as opposed to more benign personnel management for the benefit of the organization. So let's talk a little bit about the discrete functions of human resource management. How do we, as public managers and leaders, manage these human resources within our organization? I know some of you work in HR offices, and so you are already experts on human resource management and could probably, teach this part of the course tonight. Some of you probably have not really had a lot to do with HR outside of being hired into your position or every now and then being contacted by HR for position reclassifications or things such as that. So let's go through the discrete functions of how we manage human resources in our public organizations and talk about some of the strategies we use in the public sector that certainly differ from the strategies we see used in the private sector. And as we've mentioned before in this class, that first function of recruitment is one of our primary distinctions between the two sectors. We know that when we recruit employees to work in the public sector, we have different values that we are trying to achieve. We're not only trying to hire people with the skill set to make our organizations efficient and effective, like in the private sector, but we are also trying to promote social equity and social justice. We're also trying to promote a representative bureaucracy. We want to hire people who have the ability and the wherewithal to protect the constitutional rights of people that they are dealing with. So our different set of values in the public sector will mean that we're going to use different recruitment strategies. If you've ever recruited for a position in a public organization, you know that it tends to be a very long and very protracted process. So instead of being able to interview somebody and hire them that same day, like you would in a private corporation, you have to go through a whole lot of steps. And as I think I've discussed with you before, whenever we have to hire for someone to work in the Cal State system, we're going to have to work very closely with our Office of Equity and Diversity. So when we put together that vacancy announcement, that announcement of here is the position that's available, here's what that position does, here are the minimum knowledge, skills, and abilities, here are the preferred qualifications. That position vacancy announcement has to be approved, reviewed, and approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity to make sure that we are doing the right type of outreach so that we can get a very diverse workforce into our organization. So that vacancy announcement needs to be approved. We then also have to put together a recruitment plan. And that recruitment plan, we have to list our specific recruitment strategies. Where are we going to advertise this position? How often are we going to advertise this position? And we have to demonstrate that we are engaging in targeted recruitment, that we are advertising this position in places that will reach out to members of underrepresented populations. And so whenever we hire a faculty member or administrator, we not only go to the professional organization and list it in the job board of that professional organization, but we also look at other organizations that work to represent the interests of people from underrepresented populations. And so, for instance, for American Public Administration, we would look at the APSA Council on Women Administrators and advertise with them. Since we have such an overlap with political science, we will do the same type of thing in political science organizations that uh, work to recruit and to help foster the career development of minority populations. So we need to make sure that we are engaging in this targeted recruitment, and that needs to be evidenced within our recruitment plan. That recruitment plan needs to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity before we can do the advertising. Then once it's approved and we do our advertising, we solicit our applications. Those applications, when they come in, that applicant pool then must also be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity to make sure that it is sufficiently diverse to then move ahead. If your applicant pool is not sufficiently diverse and it gets rejected by equity and diversity, then you would have to go back out and recruit again and start the process over again. Once your initial pool has been approved, you can then go through your review process. And as you go through your review process, you'll then whittle down the applications to maybe a semi-finalist that perhaps you will do Zoom interviews or phone interviews with. That semi-finalist pool must then also be reviewed for diversity before you can interview those individuals. Once you have then narrowed it down to your 3 finalists, then that finalist pool must then also be reviewed. The interview questions that you use in your semifinalists and your finalist interviews must also be approved by Equity and Diversity to make sure there's not cultural bias in any of the questions or the approaches. And then when you do have your final candidate who is selected, that final candidate's approved then not only by administration, by Equity and Diversity, and then you can move forward with an offer and a hiring process. Now, that entire process of recruiting and hiring an individual may run 3, 6, 9 months, sometimes a year long. We do lose some good people that go to private sector organizations. I know at Long Beach, we've lost some faculty members in the past who've gone to SC because they've been able to be hired quicker at SC than they've been able to be hired in the Cal State system. Usually we advertise a position sometime in late July. We're probably not offering that position until late February or early March. So there is quite this gap. Now, in terms of academic hiring, that's not as big of a deal because a lot of the people you are hiring are oftentimes coming just out with their PhDs. And so they're probably still what we call ABD, all but dissertation. But if you're hiring administrators, if you're hiring managers, it becomes much more difficult process whenever you have this protracted process of hiring. But that recruitment process that's done in the public sector is obviously much different than the private sector, just interviewing someone, hiring them, putting them on payroll the same day or maybe the next day or the next week. So recruitment is done for the purpose of trying to achieve all those various goals that we have in public administration that are more varied and also more complex than some of the goals that you would see in terms of efficiency and effectiveness in private sector corporations. And again, we're painting here with a very broad brushstroke. There are certainly some social equity corporations out there who are working very hard to try and foster social justice and social equity. And so, we give a nod to those corporations. So we're kind of painting the broad brushstroke here between the two sectors. There's certainly variability within both the private and the public sector. When we select people from our applicant pool, we move to the second function, which is selection. As we said, we rely primarily on knowledge, skills, and abilities. At the federal level, that used to be using examinations. And so the examination that was typically used at the federal level, if anyone has worked for the federal government for a long time, was what was known as the PACE exam. And that PACE exam was then provided to measure the ability and the knowledge of those people to do the specific jobs that they have applied for. We have learned that examinations have problems. One of the primary problems with job-related examinations is the problem of validity. We know some of these examinations are not valid from a variety of different types of perspectives. Some of these examinations suffer from what we call content validity or content validity issues, I should say. We want content validity, but some of these exams suffer from issues with content validity. Content validity is what it sounds like. It means that the content of the exam correlates to the content of the job. We shouldn't be hiring someone into a custodial position with an examination that includes higher order calculus or things like that that are not necessary for success and effectiveness on the job. The Griggs versus Duke Power Company case is an example of when the court stepped in and said you cannot use examinations that do not correlate with the content of the job that they are testing for. Some other types of validity that we struggle with in terms of examinations are things like criterion and predictive validity. Criterion and predictive validity, the way in which we measure for those is, first off, with criterion validity, well, we'll start with predictive. With predictive validity, what we will do is we'll make sure that the examination, performance on the examination, is a valid predictor of performance on the job. So in predictive validity, what we will do is we will then take the people who scored the highest on the exam, hire them into the position, and then we will evaluate their performance in the position. Those who scored high on the exam should score high in terms of their performance evaluation. The exam is then a strong predictor of performance on the job. A variation on predictive validity is what's called concurrent validity. And with concurrent validity, what we will do is we will take existing employees and then we will give them this exam. And then those people who are high performers on the job, you would expect would perform well in the exam. Those who do not perform well on the job, you would expect to score poorly on the exam. So that's kind of what we call a concurrent approach to measuring validity. And then criterion validity is where we are looking at the actual criteria, the actual characteristics of the job, and making sure those criteria match up with the criteria of being successful on the exam. One of the problems with the criterion validity is when we have cultural bias. And if our questions, if what we are testing for, those things are culturally biased, then it's going to be hard for us to say that, yes, the criteria for the job are reflected in terms of the criteria of the exam, because sometimes people are not going to perform that well on the exam, but it's because of that type of cultural bias. So we've had a world of problems with examinations. And also then you have things like test anxiety, where people just don't perform well in this artificial test environment. And so one of the things that some agencies have done is they have replaced their examinations with these things called assessment centers. So in an assessment center, what you will do is you'll set up a simulated work environment. Then you'll bring in your potential applicants, usually a limited number of them, to then do the type of work they're actually going to do if they're hired in these assessment centers. And then you monitor and you examine the work that they're doing. You look at their performance in the assessment center. The idea is we actually get to see them doing the type of work they're going to have to do on a daily basis. The problem with assessment centers is they're very costly. You're setting up kind of this artificial work environment on a Saturday morning, which is going to cost you money and resources to do. And then also you have your Hawthorne effect that we're all familiar with because of our review of Elton Mayo and his Hawthorne experiments. That when you are watching someone work, they are going to perform differently than if they don't know they're being watched. So by sitting here and watching someone perform in an assessment center, they're probably going to do their best work, and then their best work may not be the same type of work that they're doing when they are hired for the position. So examinations have mostly been replaced with a review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we'll take this more holistic review of the candidate, looking at their education, looking at their experience, the skills and certifications that they have, and we'll do that more holistic judgment to determine if they are the person who should be hired, the appropriate person should be hired for that position. So it's a more decentralized, more holistic way of hiring than it was in the 1970s and the 1980s. Once we have people in the organization, we have hired them, then we need to allocate the work and evaluate the work. And that's then our third discrete function, allocation and evaluation. So in order to allocate the work, to decide who does what on a daily basis, we have to get involved in doing a lot of what Frederick Taylor talked to us about with scientific management, which are things like a job analysis. So we will deconstruct each position in our organization to see what goes into that job on a daily basis. What types of functions are being done by the incumbent on a daily basis in this position? What percentage of time are they spending, answering phones? What percentage of time are they spending greeting visitors to the headquarters? Whatever the case may be. What are they doing? How much time are they spending doing that? What types of knowledge, skills, and abilities are required in order to successfully do these functions? So we'll analyze each individual job in isolation based upon those characteristics. Once we have analyzed each job in our organization, we then know what those jobs are about, so we can then engage in what's called a job evaluation. And a job evaluation is where we start to compare the different positions to each other for the purpose of placing these positions on a position classification schedule. We put positions in a position classification schedule so we can then award compensation in a fair and equitable manner. So those positions that are higher on our position classification schedule will then get higher compensation than those who are at a lower level. So in the job evaluation, we are comparing our positions to each other based upon the results of our individual job analysis. So an example of a job evaluation is what's called a point factor evaluation. Now, if you've ever done any work in HR, I'm sure you've done a point factor evaluation. It is the simplest and by far the most commonly used type of job evaluation in organizations. In a point factor job evaluation, what we will do is, say, for instance, we're in a police department. We'll look at the position of the police chief and compare it to the position of a patrol officer. So our job analysis tells us that for a police chief, they have a lot of supervisory responsibilities. They're running the entire police department. They have a lot of responsibility in terms of communicating with external stakeholders. They're going to be the ones going out there talking to city council, talking with the fire department, talking with members of the media whenever there's some big incident or event that has happened. So they're going to really be out there in the public talking to external stakeholders. We also know they have budgetary management responsibilities. They have to construct and manage the budget for the police department. But then when it comes to something like risk of physical harm, they're not at very much risk of physical harm as compared to a patrol officer. So for this police chief position, they would score very high on the factor of supervisory responsibilities, very high on the factor of budget management, very high on the factor of outreach to external stakeholders, but would score very low on risk of physical harm. That's the complete opposite to a patrol officer position. That patrol officer will probably not have budgetary requirements, will not have a lot of supervisory requirements, other than if they're just, training a rookie officer. But beyond that, they're really not going to have a lot of supervisory responsibilities. They're not going to have nearly the responsibilities of speaking to the media that the police chief may have. They will probably have a lot more risk of physical harm because they're out there patrolling the streets on a daily basis. So they would score very much higher on that factor. So we break the position up into different factors. We then weight each of these factors in terms of their importance to the position. So for the police chief, perhaps supervisory is worth 30% of the value of the job. Maybe outreach to external constituents is worth 30%, and so on and so on. So you add a weighting mechanism to each one of these factors. Then based upon how important that factor is to each job, you then attach points, multiply the points by the weighting factor, add up your scores, and that will then give you a summative score for that position. And then you can take that summative score for the police chief, compare it to the summative score for the patrol officer, and then you can use those summative scores to then array your positions in your position classification system. So that's what's known as a point factor type of evaluation. Now, some of you may have lived through position reclassification studies in your organizations. So employees can ask for a reclassification of their position. So if they feel that their position has changed substantially enough, that what they're doing on a daily basis is different than what it was in the past, they can ask for a reclassification study. HR will then come in and shadow that person and follow that person, sit with that person through a course of a workday, look at what they are doing and see if what they are doing is the same as what the employee is reporting that they are doing. Then we'll use that information to determine whether or not that position needs to be reclassified. So maybe a position will get reclassified from a GS11 to a GS12 because it has now assumed additional functions that require more supervisory skills and abilities. So a lot of people will live through these reclassification studies. The problem with reclassification studies, they're very costly, they're very time intensive, and they also create a slippery slope where when one person gets their position reclassified, then a lot of other people are going to ask to have their position reclassified as well. I don't know if I shared with you or not, but when I was on the board, we started a reclassification study. We started it a year and a half before I left the board, and it was still ongoing when I left the board when my term ended. And that was after a year and a half of doing reclassification. So it's a very lengthy, time-consuming process. All this information that we have collected in our job analysis and job evaluations, we can then incorporate within our position descriptions. So every position in the public sector should have its own position description. Your position hopefully has a position description that you are familiar with. Traditional position descriptions will say, here are the functions that are done on a daily basis. Here's the percentage of time that's done or spent on these different functions. Here are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required to effectively do these functions. Let's see, Monica said, do they use these systems to determine if a position should have a step increase as well? Sometimes a step increase may come as a result of not wanting to reclassify the position to a higher classification, but still to kind of reward this person for having additional duties. In my district, sometimes what we would end up doing is if the position, we didn't want to reclassify the position, we would then enter into a memorandum of understanding with that class of employees that here are some additional duties that you are doing. And so here is a stipend that you'll receive for those additional duties. So it didn't push them into a higher classification, but still provided them with some additional pay for those additional duties that they have assumed. But sometimes it will, but oftentimes those steps in terms of salary, those steps are going to come from your longevity in that position with that organization. So as you move vertically in the position classification, it's based upon your classification, your position. As you move horizontally, those steps are oftentimes associated with your longevity in that position in that organization. But if your functions do change in terms of this job, then there should be something to compensate that person for those changes in those functions. But those functions are going to be spelled out there in your position description. And that's why it's a traditional description. You're going to have here are the functions and the percentage of time on each of these functions. The problem with those traditional position descriptions is they don't really have indicators of performance. This is what you are doing and how much time you're spending on it, but there's not really indication of how well you should be doing that function. That's why some organizations have replaced their traditional position descriptions with RODs, which are results-oriented descriptions. So in a results-oriented description, we will then add on, in addition to the function and the amount of time spent on that function, we will then add on performance expectations. So let's say it's someone who is working at the front desk of this building for this agency. And so their job will be a certain amount of time spent answering the phone, certain amount of time spent greeting visitors, a certain amount of time referring visitors to the proper office. So those are three main functions. A fourth function could be writing correspondence. We'll just say those are the four main functions that they're going to be doing. In a traditional description, it'll just say the percentage of time spent on each of those functions. In an ROD, we'll have performance expectations. So answering the phone, maybe you'll spend 20% of your time answering the phone. The performance expectation is that every call will be answered no later than the second ring, and the standard greeting will be used every time a phone call is answered. That's the expectation we have for answering the phones. Maybe in terms of referring people to the appropriate office, the visitors are referred to the appropriate office 100% of the time. That's the expected type of performance. Greeting visitors, every visitor is greeted upon arrival 100% of the time. So you incorporate those performance expectations into the job description. That then makes it much easier for you to then engage in the next part of evaluation, which is performance evaluation. So previously we were evaluating the content of the job. Now in performance evaluation, we're going to evaluate the performance of the person in that position. So how well are they doing their job? Performance evaluation is difficult. And it's difficult because you have resistance on the part of employees to have their performance evaluated. There's always this fear of a negative evaluation, always this fear of what we call cognitive dissonance. Employees always feel they're doing a good job. However, when they get their performance evaluation and it says they're not doing a good job, that creates this cognitive dissonance, and this cognitive dissonance then makes them fear future performance evaluations. Managers also shy away from performance evaluation because of this fear of playing God, that these associated rewards and penalties that come with performance evaluation are so important that they feel bad. That if someone gets a poor evaluation, it means they may not be eligible for a promotion. They may not be eligible for this training academy. So they know that the consequences are so high that they really don't want to hurt the chances of their employees. And so they also shy away from performance evaluations. Performance evaluations can be done in a variety of manners. We're not going to get into the granular detail of going through examples of these, but one of the most common types is graphic rating. And we're all familiar with graphic rating. So you'll have a statement, the employee is on time 5 days per week. Strongly agree, neither, disagree, and then strongly disagree. That kind of Likert ordinal scale, that's a graphic rating. We could do a excellent, good, fair, poor type of rating as well. That's a graphic rating type of approach. It's very simple. It's very easy to do. The problem with graphic rating is it leads to errors. One common error in graphic rating is the halo effect. And so in the halo effect, if a manager likes an employee, they're going to just circle excellent for every single one of those parts on the evaluation form. So they make the person look angelic, hence a halo effect. Another problem with graphic rating is what's known as the recency effect. The recency effect is that a manager will evaluate someone's performance based upon their most recent interaction with them. So someone may have performed quite well for 12 months, but then last week you had a negative interaction with them, and then that will affect the way in which you evaluate their overall performance. There's also a regression to the mean type of error, where you'll have managers who will just circle the average and just go right down the middle, regress all their answers to the mean. Argument sometimes being, well, it gives the employee some place to go. It allows them room for growth. But the problem with that is if the employee is expecting an excellent evaluation, they get an average evaluation. We again then have that cognitive dissonance. But it's a very quick, very easy way of doing it. The problem is you don't get a lot of formative feedback. So you get, yes, I am performing on an excellent level. I'm performing on a good level. If I'm performing at a good level, I want to be at an excellent level. Absent an essay, absent a narrative analysis, it's only going to be summative. And I'm not going to get the formative feedback that I need to then improve my performance to the level I want to improve it to. You'll see, forced choice ranking. Those are kind of self-descriptive. The one at the bottom I will focus a little bit on very quickly, and that's the BARS approach. BARS stands for behaviorally anchored rating scales. So in a behaviorally anchored rating scale, what you will do is you will anchor the ratings, excellent, good, fair, A, B, C, whatever it may be. You'll anchor those ratings to specific behaviors. So if you exhibit this behavior, it will lead to a grade of A. You exhibit this behavior, it'll lead to a grade of B. So it's very commonly used in academics in terms of our grading rubrics. So when we establish those grading rubrics, those tend to be behaviorally anchored rating scales. Nice thing about behaviorally anchored rating scales is that they combine both the summative as well as the formative. So you'll see the summative evaluation, but then you'll also know if I didn't get the excellent rating, it's because I didn't exhibit this desired behavior. So I've seen a lot of organizations put the time and effort into kind of migrating toward these behaviorally anchored rating scales. But then based upon the performance of an employee, that then leads us to our fourth discrete function, which unfortunately sometimes is discipline and sanctioning. Now, there is a misconception out there in the world that you cannot terminate a career civil servant. Career civil servants can be terminated from their positions, but they can only be terminated based upon performance. So any type of discipline and sanctioning must flow directly from the performance evaluation of that employee. And all of this in the public sector really boils down to the one word of documentation. So if we document poor performance, we are then required to provide opportunities for training and development. If that training and development is provided and the performance is still poor, then we will have to provide more training and development. Then we reassess the performance. If it's still poor, then we have to provide more training and development, so on and so on. So when we do get to the point of discipline and sanctioning for the purpose of firing someone or sanctioning someone based on their performance, we must document all the times we have intervened with opportunities for training and development along the way. And you're right, Olga, violations of policies, that does put us into a different category for discipline, sanctioning, and termination. Violation of policies, violation of laws, that does make it easier to terminate career civil servants as opposed to terminating them based upon their performance. Terminating based upon performance, you're going to need to document all these training opportunities that have been provided to those employees. If you don't document it, then you're certainly going to get a grievance filed with the union. You're probably going to get a grievance filed with CalPERB at the state level or with perhaps a Merit Systems Protection Board or OSC at the national level. So it's document, document, document when you're doing discipline and sanctioning. So we have all these functions that we engage in when we manage human resources. But overlaid upon all of that, you have the influence of public employee unions. And we do know that, as we said before in this class, public sector employees tend to be unionized at about 3 times the rate of their private sector counterparts. So there's a lot more union influence and collective bargaining influence in the public as compared to the private sector. So when you have these bargaining units, you have these unionized employees, they will engage in this collective bargaining process. The collective bargaining process will differ depending upon if you're talking about a federal agency or a state or local agency. And it can also differ in among state and local governments in terms of what types of issues can be negotiated over. The types of issues that can be negotiated over are said to be within what's called the permissive scope of bargaining. So the scope of bargaining just means the types of issues that can be negotiated. Some states have a very permissive scope of bargaining where a lot of issues are on the table in the collective bargaining process. Some states have a much more restricted scope of bargaining. We see that in a lot of southern states where a lot of issues are off the table and you're not able to collectively bargain over those issues. At the national level, typically the issue of compensation is not within the permissive scope of bargaining, which is strange for us at the state and local level because that's oftentimes the primary issue that we negotiate over in collective bargaining. But the federal level, that is beyond the permissive scope of bargaining. And the reason why compensation is outside the permissive scope of bargaining at the national level is because Congress establishes the compensation for the federal bureaucracy. So there is a commission on compensation that is established in the executive branch that then provides some guidance to Congress as it decides if and how to increase the compensation of administrators at the federal level. They will provide the recommendations to Congress. Congress will then make the decision about how compensation will change in the general schedule. Since it's Congress's job, it's outside of the permissive scope of bargaining. Once you get engaged in the collective bargaining process, if the two sides, the bargaining unit and management, are unable to come to a negotiated settlement, one of the two sides can then declare what's called an impasse. And we see this happen a lot, especially at the local level. We saw that recently with the California Faculty Union, where they issued an impasse. They declared an impasse. Once an impasse has been declared, then there are several resolution strategies that can be used to try and resolve that impasse. One approach is what's known as fact finding. In fact finding, you'll bring in an independent fact finder who will then collect all the information about what's been going on in that collective bargaining process and will then put together a fact finder report. The fact finder report is essentially just a report of what's happened in the collective bargaining process. Now, that is not a binding resolution to the process. It's just a report. That report then gets provided to both sides in the negotiations and will then be embargoed. Typically, we embargo a fact-finding report for about 2 weeks, allow the two sides to have their exclusive access to it. Hopefully, in those 2 weeks, when they have exclusive access, they can then come to an agreement after reviewing the fact-finding report. Typically, the fact-finding report may make one or the other party look kind of bad. And so it may say, well, in this fact-finding report, management really isn't playing all that fair in terms of their offers. And so you may see that the union's providing counters that are reasonable counters. Maybe the union saying a 2% increase, and then management's coming back with a 0% increase. And then union comes back with a 1.75% increase. And then the management comes back with a 0% increase. And so that'll all be in the fact-finding report. If you don't look good in the fact-finding report, you're probably going to want to come to a resolution before that fact-finding report goes public after that 2-week embargo. So it's just kind of the light of fire under one of the two sides to try and get a resolution. Then there's mediation. The federal government has an organization called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. Federal Mediation Conciliation Service has trained federal mediators who they will then send out across the country to go into these collective bargaining negotiations and try and mediate the differences between the two parties. One of my political science professors in college was a federal mediator, worked for the Conciliation Service, was gone almost all the time because they were sending him all over the country to do mediation and collective bargaining. But that oftentimes is not conclusive. That's not going to be binding. It's just a way in which you can try and get a third party to come in and try and find a negotiated settlement. Then there's arbitration. And if you truly want to get a resolution to this impasse, you will use what is called final offer binding arbitration. And there are different approaches to arbitration, but this is what's known as final offer binding arbitration. And this, I'm typing and talking, so finding offer binding arbitration. This is when you absolutely need to have a resolution to this impasse. So you'll have an arbiter who will come in, and that arbiter will say, management, give me your final offer. Union, give me your final offer. We'll then weigh those two offers, and we'll pick one of those offers. That selection by that arbiter is then binding. And so both parties have to then accept that offer. That offer then becomes the collective bargaining agreement. So that's kind of your last ditch effort when you can't come to an agreement, but you have to. Final offer binding arbitration. But those are just some examples of ways in which we can resolve some of these impasses that can occur in the collective bargaining process. But collective bargaining is important in the public sector because it certainly does overlay on top of all the career civil service protections, some of these protections that are built into the collective bargaining agreement, so that when we are managing our human resources, we have to not only be conversant in career civil service protections, but we also have to be conversant in the details embodied within that collective bargaining agreement. That's why it's made it much more complex to manage human resources in the public sector. That's why a lot of organizations have migrated toward doing human resource management in their offices of human resources, allowing the human resource professionals to do the management of human resources, at least in terms of career civil service protections and union types of requirements, collective bargaining agreement requirements. And not all organizations do that, but what that's done is it's kind of created a field for people who have come out with their MPA who have an interest in human resource management has given them places to go in terms of careers doing human resource management in public organizations. So it has become much more centralized within the agency as opposed to becoming more centralized outside at the federal level and at the state level. So outside the agency, it's become more centralized. In the agency, it's actually become much more centralized in managing human resources. But as we said, 85 to 90% of our public budgets will be devoted to human resources through salaries, benefits, costs for professional development. It consumes a huge majority of our public budgets, which means it is a major function that we engage in on a daily basis in our public organizations. I know I've been talking for a while. I want to make sure we get through all the information at least that will be covered on the final assessment tonight. I see it's 7:30, so I think we're well overdue for a break. So just for the sake of time tonight, let's take a 10-minute break. And if we can come back at 7:40, then we will talk about our final function, which is the management of fiscal financial resources, cover the rest of the information that is going to be covered on the final assessment. Then we will assess where we are on time. If we have some time left, then we will talk about some of these current challenges and issues facing contemporary public administration, and that will then certainly take us through the remainder of our evening tonight. So take 10 minutes, come on back, and we'll talk finances and budgeting. Okay, welcome back from our very brief break. Let's jump into our final function, which is managing financial resources. I'm going to try and curtail my comments a little bit here. I could talk all night on public finances, and I'll try not to do that to you. And to make sure that we can get through all the information that's on the final assessment so that you'll have everything you need to do an outstanding job on that final. So, in addition to managing human resources, we also know that we have to manage the public taxpayer money. And as we talked about with our accountability and ethics discussion, when we are managing taxpayer money, it really does heighten the accountability standards. And so we're going to have a lot more scrutiny upon us, and rightly so, to make sure we're managing that public taxpayer money in efficient and effective ways. So whenever we talk about budgets, I used to teach a public budgeting course for many, many years, and I've taught it here at CSUN as well. That whenever I talk about budgets, we think about budgets as kind of dollars and cents. We think about a budget as here is our statement of what we are going to spend our money on and how much money we are going to spend in the next fiscal year. So a budget is a prospective document that tells us what we're spending our money on and how much money we are spending. However, budgets really go beyond just a statement of dollars and cents. And budgets are really a statement of societal priorities. In the public sector, we are faced with infinite demands, and we have to respond to those infinite demands with finite resources. Infinite demands and finite resources means that we are going to have to strategize. We are going to have to make certain types of decisions. So if we put more money behind education, K through 12 education, there's an opportunity cost, which means we're probably going to be able to put less money behind a health and welfare type of program. So we are making those types of decisions. We are giving you a statement in our budget of this is what we prioritize as a government and as a society. So a budget is not just a statement of dollars and cents, it is a statement of societal priorities. Once you start defining a budget as a statement of societal priorities, you are really elevating that budget. And you're making that budget much, much more important and significant than it would have been if it's just a statement of dollars and cents. This statement of priorities, this budget, typically in the public sector, budgets take one of two different forms. You can have operating budgets or capital budgets. And for those of you who work on a daily basis with public budgets, you know this information, but an operating budget is a budget for our day-to-day expenditures as an organization. So how we pay for our salary and our benefits, how we pay for maintenance, utilities, supplies, those day-to-day functioning, that is going to be in that operating budget. For our more long-term types of decisions, such as capital projects, those will be segregated into a separate capital budget. So for those capital projects, we'll put together that capital improvement plan. That capital improvement plan will be a 5-year plan where we will schedule all these capital, long-term, high price tag, non-recurring types of projects, fleet of police vehicles, new city hall, new recreation center. These are capital projects because they cost a lot of money, and we're not going to be doing them every single year like we're going to be paying for salary and benefits and supplies every year in our operating budget. So we segregate these types of spending into a separate capital budget so that we can be more rational, comprehensive in our decision making. So we have more time, we can take into account more information in making those types of decisions on those capital projects. So operating budgets versus capital budgets. For the most part tonight, we're going to focus primarily on operating budgets because those are the budgets that we are going to be dealing with on a daily basis. So how does a public budget get put together? How does a public budget get created? Well, my favorite answer to everything is it depends. And it depends upon which level of government you are talking about. Most state and local governments will kind of model their budgeting processes on the federal budget process. So they kind of follow the polemic that's set up by the federal budget process. So much so that just about every budget process will have 4 different phases to it: a preparation and planning phase, a formulation phase, an execution phase, and then an evaluation phase. So what happens in each one of those phases of the budgeting process? Well, let's look at the federal level, not because we all work at the federal level, but because the federal level, again, kind of creates this template that a lot of state and local governments then use similar types of approaches in putting their budgets together. So let's just start at the federal level and kind of look at the federal budgeting process. So at the federal level, in the preparation phase, the preparation phase will start long before the fiscal year. So we're talking a year and a half, 2 years, sometimes longer, before the beginning of the fiscal year is when we'll start preparation for that budget. In preparation, what will happen is we'll do revenue forecasts, we will do expenditure estimates. We'll ask the question, how much revenue do we anticipate generating in that next fiscal year? We'll ask questions such as, how much money will we need to spend to maintain our current level of services in the next fiscal year? Those revenue forecasts, those expenditure estimates will then give us the information we need to prepare the federal budget. A couple of the major organizations that are involved in the preparation phase are organizations such as the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office. The Office of Management and Budget serves the president. It's in the executive branch. The Congressional Budget Office is a legislative organization that serves Congress. Their purposes are kind of similar in that they both put together forecasts of revenues and expenditure estimates. The methodologies that they use, however, can be very different. So typically, the types of revenue forecasts that we get from the Office of Management and Budget, those tend to be much more optimistic than the revenue forecasts that are put together by the Congressional Budget Office. And the reason for that is that the Office of Management and Budget serves the president. And so since the Office of Management and Budget serves the president, the OMB basically has an audience of one. That audience of one would like to have very rosy scenarios about the amount of revenue we're going to be able to generate. And so OMB kind of responds to the pressures placed upon it by that audience of one. Congressional Budget Office is serving 535 individual members of Congress. So it can be a little bit more realistic in terms of its revenue forecast. So it tends to be a little bit more pessimistic about how much revenue we'll be able to generate in the next fiscal year. We put together these revenue forecasts and these expenditure estimates, and then based upon those forecasts and estimates, the Office of Management and Budget, which is the central clearinghouse for the federal government, will then put out a call to federal agencies and departments for their budget requests. It's what used to be called Circular A-22. But they would put out this request and they would say, agencies and departments, let us know what your proposed budget is for next year. All the agencies and departments will submit their budget requests to the Office of Management and Budget. Office of Management and Budget, when they receive those requests, they will then review those requests, and typically they will make cuts to those requests. Those reduced requests will then be assembled together into the executive budget that will then be delivered to the president, to the White House. That usually happens in January. Informed by that executive budget, the president will oftentimes then give the State of the Union address, usually in late January. Now, we've gotten kind of flexible with that in recent years, and you've seen, like in the last State of the Union address, President Biden did not give it in January. I believe it was in March or April when he gave the State of the Union. Typically in the past, the State of the Union is usually provided in very late January. And remember, the Constitution tells us that presidents must update Congress from time to time on the State of the Union. It doesn't say when they have to do it, doesn't say how they have to do it. It just says they have to do it. So typically what will happen is the Speaker of the House will issue an invitation to the president in late January to come and address a joint session of Congress to provide the State of the Union. A lot of what the president talks about, the priorities that they will talk about in the State of the Union address, will be based upon the priorities in that executive budget. Then usually in early February, the president will release the executive budget. It gets released to the media, and it then gets released to Congress. Once the president's budget goes to Congress, we have now finished the preparation phase, and we then move into the second phase, which is formulation. So in the second formulation phase, this is where Congress gets to review the executive budget. So this is going to begin sometime in February. And in theory, if everything goes correctly, it will then end on September 30th, which is the last day of the preceding fiscal year, in time for the beginning of the new federal fiscal year, which begins on October 1st. Now, the federal fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. State fiscal years will be on a different calendar. So for instance, here in California, for the vast majority of our state agencies, the state fiscal year runs from July 1st until June 30th. So a completely different calendar than the federal fiscal year. But from February until September 30th, we're in formulation, where Congress is reviewing the executive budget. That executive budget, when it arrives at Congress, goes to the Budget Committee in the House and the Budget Committee in the Senate. There's one in the House and one in the Senate. The job of the budget committees is to pass what is called a concurrent resolution on the budget. The concurrent resolution on the budget establishes here is the maximum amount of money that can be spent in each programmatic area. So here's the maximum that can be spent on agriculture, the maximum that can be spent on health and human services, the maximum that can be spent on defense, and so on and so on. That concurrent resolution on the budget is meant to impose fiscal discipline on Congress. Based upon those limitations that come out of the concurrent resolution on the budget, those limitations should then guide the rest of the formulation process. And so from that point, that concurrent resolution on the budget must be adopted by Congress no later than April 15th. I don't think it's a coincidence that it occurs on tax day, but it must be approved no later than April 15th. At that point, the process then shifts to the appropriations committees. And again, not to get into too many of the nitty-gritty details here, but there are, I think we may have mentioned before in a previous class, there are two different types of federal spending. There's appropriation spending, which is discretionary, and then there's mandatory spending, which goes through an authorization process. Discretionary spending, Congress has direct control over. That goes through appropriations. Mandatory spending, Congress is required to spend this money, like interest on the national debt. They do not have direct control over changing that spending. That goes through an authorizations process. So in the appropriations process for discretionary spending, that spending will then go to the Appropriations Committee in the House and the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. There's one Appropriations Committee in the House and there's one in the Senate. Each of those appropriations committees will then have 12 different subcommittees. Each of those 12 subcommittees will work on a different programmatic area. So you'll have an education appropriations subcommittee, a health and human services appropriations subcommittee. Each of those subcommittees will work on their own appropriation bill for their area of spending. They will hold hearings. They will make amendments going through what we call the markup process. Will then pass their appropriation bill up to the parent appropriations committee. Parent Appropriations Committee, when they receive these bills from the subcommittees, they will then do their own markup process, make their own amendments, and then pass those appropriation bills to the floor of the House or to the floor of the Senate, depending upon the body. Once those appropriation bills go to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate, they typically go to the floor as what we call privileged pieces of legislation, which means that they will have very few amendments that are allowed to them, and the debate will be limited in terms of how much time each party has to debate those bills. If everything works the way in which it's supposed to, all 12 of those appropriation bills will get passed by the House, will get passed by the Senate. The ones that come out of the House will probably look a little bit different than the ones that come out of the Senate. So we then have to have a conference committee to hammer out the details between those two versions of the bill. Once those differences are hammered out, then that bill goes back to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate to be passed again. Then once it's passed, it then goes to the desk of the president for the president's signature. If everything goes well, all 12 appropriation bills will be passed no later than September 30th, the end of the fiscal year, and then signed by the president before the first day of the new fiscal year on October 1st. Once the president signs these appropriation bills, and we're kind of live in fairy tale land for just a minute here. When the president signs all those appropriation bills by October 1st, on October 1st, we then start spending the money. That then shifts us from the formulation into the execution phase. So execution phase of budgeting is that fiscal year. So it'll run from October 1st until September 30th is when agencies are allocated the money. They go out there and they actually start spending the money in the legally appropriated manner they're supposed to spend it. Now, as we know, it's exceedingly rare for Congress to get its job done. Congress typically does not get all 12 appropriation bills passed by September 30th. And we saw that again this year. When there are unpassed appropriation bills, it means that those areas that are supposed to be funded by that bill do not have the legal authority to operate come 12:01 a.m. on October 1st. So what Congress has to do is it will pass continuing resolutions. So if the ag bill is not passed, then the Congress will pass a continuing resolution that will fund the Department of Agriculture at 80% of what it got funded for that period last year. And it'll usually do it for about a 2-week or a 4-week period of time. So it's a temporary stopgap measure. In those 2 to 4 weeks before the continuing resolution expires, the hope obviously is Congress will come up with an agreement and pass the actual appropriation bill. When that doesn't happen, Congress passes another continuing resolution, then another one, and then another one, until Congress kind of loses its political willpower to continue passing continuing resolutions. Or the president intervenes and they say, no more continuing resolutions. At that point, then you either have a government shutdown for those areas that don't have legal authority to keep operating, or you have what's called an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as an OBRA. Again, that's an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. In this OBRA, what Congress will do is it'll take all these unpassed appropriation bills, it will cobble them all together into a massive piece of legislation known as an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. When it squeezes all these unpassed appropriation bills together, it creates a mammoth piece of legislation. And in order to get people to vote in favor of this omnibus bill, you usually have to include their pet projects. So you may have a senator from, let's make it up, from West Virginia, who says, I want to have a bridge in my state and I want to have it named after me. Well, let's go ahead and put that into the OBRA because then this member from West Virginia will then vote for the OBRA. And so all these members get their pet projects, what we refer to as pork barrel spending, all put into this OBRA, this Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And the OBRA then becomes larger and larger and larger, can be thousands of pages long, so big that whenever that OBRA is passed by Congress and signed by the president, we really don't even know what's in there. There are so many details, so many different projects. It's going to take us 2, 3, 4 weeks before we're actually going to be able to figure out what we approved in this OBRA. These omnibus budget reconciliation acts really do lead to a lot of government overspending. And this is the way in which we usually make budgets. So the process is pass 12 appropriation bills by the beginning of the new fiscal year. Almost never happens. In recent years, almost every time we put a federal budget together, it's been through this Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. But however we do it, as we enter the fiscal year, we then spend the money through to the end of the fiscal year. Once that fiscal year ends on September 30th, then we move into the evaluation phase. And that evaluation phase is where we then audit the books. We make sure that the money is being spent in the way in which it's legally supposed to be spent. And then we'll do things like performance and management audits to ask the question, how well did we spend the money that was in this budget? Here in California, the budget process is a little bit different. We don't have 12 different appropriation bills. Here in California, we have one budget bill. That one budget bill that's put together by the governor and the Department of Finance with some chiming in from the Legislative Analyst's Office. So the corollary to OMB here in California is the Department of Finance. The corollary to the Congressional Budget Office here in California is the LAO, the Legislative Analyst's Office. So we'll, based upon their forecasts and projections, we'll then put together the executive budget, a budget bill. That budget bill is put together in January and then goes to the state legislature. Not a whole lot happens with the governor's budget until May, because here in California, as you're probably all painfully aware of, we have this little thing in California known as the May revise. The May revise is where LAO and the Department of Finance will go back and revise their forecast assumptions in terms of the amount of revenue that we're actually going to generate. So in January, we were speculating in terms of how much income tax revenue, how much, sales tax revenue we would be able to generate. By May, we have a much better sense of how much revenue we actually did generate. And we saw in the most recent May revise, we were trailing well behind the revenue forecast that we based the governor's budget on. And so therefore, the May revise said, we're going to have to cut major parts out of this governor's budget. And so based on that revise, then there are going to be a lot of budget cuts that the governor will propose. Those cuts will then go into this revised budget. Then throughout the remainder of May and through June 15th, the state legislature will consider that revised budget, make changes to it. Then as they are supposed to adopt the budget by June 15th, that budget is supposed to be signed by the governor by June 30th for the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. Once we enter July 1st, we are now moving to the execution phase at the state level, but we still got formulation going on. And that throughout July and August, when the legislature is actually in session, it will pass what are called trailer bills. And the trailer bills will then tell agencies and public administrators, here are the stipulations in terms of how this money in the budget is supposed to be spent. So oftentimes public agencies don't know how to spend the money. When they get the budget on July 1st, they have to wait for the passage of these trailer bills. So oftentimes agencies will hold off on spending money till they get the trailer bills, and then they know exactly how to implement these provisions in the budget. So a little bit different here in California as compared to the federal level, but the stages are still very similar. There's a preparation, a formulation, an execution, and an evaluation phase of the budgeting process. So this just underscores how complex and how time-consuming the construction of public budgets really can be. And what we do at the local level is certainly going to be dictated by what is in the state budget as well as what will be found in these federal appropriation bills. So what do budgets look like? And this is where we're going to kind of limit our discussion a little bit. What I have done is, I believe I've done this, I believe I've included examples of different budget formats, different ways in which budgets look If you haven't had any experience with budget formats, you can click on those links in our Canvas site, and it'll take you to files that have examples of what are called line item budgets, performance-based budgets, program-based budgets, and zero-based budgets. Now, I'm sure as you go through your program, you're going to have a course in finance and budgeting, so you'll get into this in a lot more detail later on. For our purposes here, instead of going through all the examples of different budget formats, I think suffice to say that here are the 4 budget formats, and here's kind of how they work and their advantages and their disadvantages. The budget that we are most familiar with is the traditional budget format, which is a line item budget. A line on a budget tells you here's what money's being spent on, here's the amount of money that's being spent. So salary line item, the amount on salaries, benefits, the amount for benefits, supplies, the amount for supplies, maintenance, the amount for maintenance, and so on and so on. It's a very simple budget format, and it really does allow us to control the amount of money we're spending. We can control how much money we're spending, and we can also control what we are spending that money on. Very simple, very traditional line item budget. Every local government is going to use some version of a line item budget. It is that pervasive, that ubiquitous across all levels of government. So you're going to see a government using a line item budget. However, the disadvantage with the line item budget is it doesn't give us a lot of details, a lot of particulars in terms of how we are spending the money. We know how much we're spending and what we're spending it on. But we don't know how well we are achieving our goals by spending money on this object of expenditure, on this line item. So to remedy that, we have a second budget format, which is called a performance-based budget. In a performance-based budget, we will build onto the line item budget by including performance measures. So we'll say, okay, here's the amount of money we're spending. This is what we're spending it on, just like with a line item budget. But then we'll get more detailed and more specific. We'll say, so for instance, let's use an example. When I taught public budgeting, I like to use John Mikesell examples. And he's from the Northeast, and so he likes to talk a lot about snow for whatever reason. So the example he always used, which isn't all that germane to us here in Southern California, but was the example of snow removal. So I said, here we have the snow removal program. We have a budget for the snow removal program. So we're going to spend X amount of money on snow removal. Well, what types of activities are we going to engage in snow removal? Well, one activity you engage in snow removal is plowing of the streets. You have to plow the snow off the streets. So you're going to have money you're spending to hire your plow operators, money that you're going to spend in terms of the fixed costs of the snow plows, the gas that you're spending in those snow plows. So there are going to be some costs associated with plowing of the streets. But we're going to use this money to plow the streets. Well, the question then becomes, well, how many streets are we plowing? Well, then we're indicator of the plowing of the streets will be the number of priority lane miles of roads that are being plowed. So those are the activities that we are engaging in. Well, so what? What's the consequence of those activities? Well, hopefully, if we're doing a good job plowing the streets, there will be fewer accidents in which snow is a contributing factor. So we'll measure the amount of accidents we had last year when snow was a contributing factor and compare it to this year. That will then give us an indicator of our performance level in plowing the streets. Well, another activity we're going to engage in is salting of the streets. And, using rock salt is a very common way of melting snow. So we'll look at the number of miles that we salted the roads, and then we'll use that indicator of number of accidents where snow is a contributing factor. But the number of accidents is not the only outcome indicator. Another indicator could be the number of citizen complaints. So if we're getting more complaints, we're probably doing a worse job clearing the streets than if we got fewer complaints. So as you can see, what we're doing is we're building these specific performance indicators into our public budget so we can answer the question of how well did we spend public taxpayer dollars on these different types of activities. A third type of budget format is a program-based budget. Now, a program-based budget is a lot different than line item and performance. Typically, when you have a performance-based budget, it is going to be built directly on a line item budget. So you'll start with the line item approach, and then you'll add on those performance measures. A program-based budget looks at and conceptualizes the budget differently. In a line item or performance-based budget, you are organizing your budget according to departments, divisions, units. So here's the budget for the Department of Police. Here is the budget for the Department of Fire. Here is the budget for the Department of Emergency Preparedness, or whatever it may be. And each department has their own individual budget. You budget according to department. In a program-based budget, you do not budget according to department, but rather you budget according to program. So for instance, you may identify a program such as protection of persons and property. That is the program. The goal of protection of persons and property is just that, to protect your citizens and to protect the property within your jurisdiction. Now, in that program of protection of persons and property, you may have several departments that contribute to the goals of protecting people and property. You may have the police department, obviously. Some of its activities, such as police patrols, will contribute to the protection of persons and property. The fire department also contributes to it in terms of responding to fire emergencies, putting out fires. They will have direct responsibility for it as well. The Department of Emergency Preparedness will also have direct responsibility for the protection of persons and property. Since all three of these departments have activities that further the protection of persons and property, they all get budgeted together under that program rubric of protection of persons and property. The advantage of budgeting according to program as opposed to department is it gives you a more holistic view of everything that your organization's doing and how all the activities across all the different departments, divisions, and units in your organization intersect with each other and help each other to accomplish your programmatic goals. A very common process that is used in program-based budgeting is a process known as crosswalking. So in crosswalking, what you will do is you will basically put a matrix together. And across the top of the matrix in your columns, you will list, here are all the different programs that we are offering as an organization. Then in your rows along the left side, you'll then list, here are all the activities. And then you'll check off the boxes where the activity aligns with the program goal. So that allows you to see which activities contribute to which programs, and then you budget all those activities that contribute to the same program together in the same budget. So it kind of breaks down the walls in your organization and focuses on the program as opposed to individual departments. The disadvantage of program-based budgeting is that it sometimes meets with resistance. So if you are a police chief and you're used to having your own departmental budget, and then along comes the city manager and says, we're going to start doing program-based budgeting, and so some of your activities are going to be budgeted with the fire department, you're probably not going to like that because you're going to feel you're losing some control over part of your budget. And so there has been a lot of pushback from division and department managers for program-based budgeting. Program-based budgeting was introduced at the federal level in the Department of Defense back in the 1960s, and the Department of Defense still uses a variation of program-based budgeting, but they're one of the only departments in the entire federal government that still uses program-based budgeting. You're probably much more likely to see program-based budgeting used at the state level, and there are still several states that use program-based budgeting. Now, for local governments, it's primarily line item budgeting. Some governments will sprinkle in some performance measures as well, but it's primarily line item budgeting for most of our local governments. And then your fourth type of budget is what's known as a zero-based budget. Now, in a zero-based budget, you require that your agencies go back and re-justify all of their existing spending. So in a line item budget, you're going to be making very incremental types of decisions. All you know in a line item budget is this is what we're spending money on, and this is how much money we're spending on that line item. That's all you know. So you basically base what you're going to spend next fiscal year on what you spent this year. So you may add on 2 or 3% to keep up with cost of living adjustments, but for the most part, you're going to keep doing what you did last year. In a zero-based budget, you're not going to take last year necessarily as assumed. So you're going to go back and re-justify what you are spending your money on to make sure you're spending money on the right types of things. Hence the reason why it's called a zero-based budget. Zero-based budgeting is more of a process than it is a finalized budget format. In that, if you're looking at a budget, you'll be able to tell pretty clearly, is this just line item? Does it have some performance measures, or is it organized around program instead of department? That will be pretty apparent to you when you look at a budget. However, it may not be apparent to you that zero-based budgeting is being used, because the zero-based budgeting process can result in a line item budget. The zero-based budgeting process can result in a performance or a program type of budget. So it's not really as much a budget format as it is a process. So what we do in zero-based budgeting is we look at our organization and we go to the lowest level in our organization where budget decisions can be made. We identify that lowest level as a decision unit, and then each of those decision units will put together what they call decision packages. Each decision package will then offer, here is an alternative for how we fund this program this year, and then here are some other alternatives. So one alternative may be funding this program at 100% of what we funded it at last year. Well, what are the consequences of that? Well, the consequences are, because we're not keeping up with cost of living adjustments, we may be able to serve fewer people than we were able to serve last year. Well, what if we funded it at 110% of what we funded at last year, a 10% increase? Well, the consequences of that will be that we are able to serve more citizens because we have a 10% budget increase. So we'll be able to serve X number more citizens with this program as compared to last year. So those decision packages will give you different courses of action. Each decision unit will then rank and prioritize the decision packages they've created, and will then send these ranked, prioritized decision packages up the organizational chart. That the next level of the organization, they will re-rank and reprioritize those decision packages, then send their rankings up to upper level management. Then upper level management will re-rank and reprioritize. Then the top ranked decision packages will then become that agency's budget. So excuse me. So it's a very decentralized, very bottom-up approach to putting a budget document together. The line item and performance and program budgeting tends to be a little bit more top-down. Zero-based budgeting tends to be very much bottom-up. The problem with zero-based budgeting is it's obviously very time-consuming and will cost you a lot of money. When you have all these different decision units, one given decision unit may put together 15 or 20 decision packages. If you have 20 decision packages coming out of every decision unit, and you have 10 decision units in your organization, you have 200 different decision packages that you're going to have to review and rank and prioritize at all levels of your organization. Very time consuming, very costly. And because of that, most organizations do not do true zero-based budgeting. Instead, what they will do is they will do a modified approach to zero-based budgeting, where they may say, for instance, let's assume that 80% of our budget this year will be done in a line item approach. But we'll take 20% of our budget and we'll subject it to a zero-based budgeting process. And we'll do that for this year. The next year, we'll subject a different 20%. Then the next year, a different 20%, and so on, so that every 5 years, part of your budget will go through the zero-based budgeting process at least once. Makes it a little bit more realistic, but still allows you to go back and in a holistic way, kind of re-justify what you are doing as an organization and how you are spending public taxpayer money. Line item budgeting really emphasizes control. Performance-based budgeting emphasizes management. It is a management tool. It gives you the information that you need in order to better manage what you are doing as an organization. Program and zero-based budgeting, as more rational approaches, emphasize planning. They allow you to plan out, strategically plan the operations of your organization. So if you just want to control your spending, line item. If you want to manage your spending better, performance. If you want to use it as a planning document, your budget, then you would do something like program or zero-based budgeting. And again, if you're interested, I have those examples up on our Canvas site that you can go and take a look at for your own edification, just kind of beyond our scope of what we do in this class to really get into those types of details. You'll get into those details in a future budgeting and finance course. But in order to put these expenditures in our budget, in order to spend this money, we must first be able to collect the money. So we know that government organizations collect money through both tax-based sources as well as non-tax sources of revenue. Tax-based sources of revenue, your big three are property, income, and sales-based taxes. Property taxes are referred to as an ability to pay tax. And a property tax is called an ability to pay tax because your ability to pay will then dictate for you how much money you have to pay in taxation. So what you have to pay in terms of your tax liability. So your ability to pay is indicated by the value of your property. As you know, here in California, if you're a homeowner, you know, we have this kind of unique approach to the way in which we do property taxation. It's called Proposition 13. Proposition 13, which was passed by the voters in 1978, imposes some limitations on how much revenue governments can generate through property taxes. It has a rate limitation, which says that the maximum rate that can be charged is 1%. Now, you may look at your property tax bill and say, mine says 1.25%. That's because there are some local add-ons beyond that 1% for things like school levies, sewer levies, and things such as that. May push you beyond the 1%. But according to Proposition 13, the base rate then is a 1% property tax rate. And then there's an assessment limitation that says that the assessed value of your property, your indicator of how much your property is worth for tax purposes, can only increase by a maximum of 2% per year. So when you combine that 1% rate limit and the 2% assessment limit together, it limits the overall amount of property tax revenue that local governments can generate. So what we saw when Proposition 13 was passed in 1978, within about 3 or 4 years, when the state stopped backfilling a lot of this local property tax revenue, we saw local governments start looking to other sources of revenue beyond the property tax because they had a hard ceiling on the amount of property tax revenue that they were able to generate for their expenditures. The property tax is an ability to pay tax that bases your tax liability on the assessed value of your home is sometimes a regressive form of taxation because it is possible that you could have a high assessed value of your home, but then be out of work. And so your liquid income is actually relatively low, but you're being taxed on a high assessed value for your property. When you have that type of disconnect between your ability to pay and how we're gauging your ability to pay, then the property tax can end up becoming somewhat regressive in nature. Survey after survey has shown us that taxpayers feel that the property tax is by far the least fair form of taxation out there, and it is the most hated form of taxation. One reason why it's the most hated form of taxation is unless you have your property taxes impounded into escrow, which are rolled into your mortgage payments, then you're going to get these very large property tax bills twice per year. And so it's a very visible type of tax. The more visible the tax is, the less likely people are to approve of that type of tax. But that's the property tax, and it's a primary source of revenue for local governments in California. Now, governments, as we said, they are less reliant upon the property tax than they were before, but it's still a primary source of revenue, especially for governments here in Southern California. Second type of taxation we're all familiar with is income taxes. An income tax is, again, an ability to pay type of tax. The indicator of your ability to pay will be your adjusted gross income. Now, the income tax is seen as being fairer than the property tax because we have a lot of what we call circuit breakers, which are tax breaks that are provided in the income tax code. So you have deductions. You can either claim a standard deduction or you can itemize your deductions. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 greatly expanded the standard deduction to try and make tax filing simpler so that more people would claim the standard deduction, fewer people would itemize their taxes. Also, that act also reduced the amount of state and local taxes that you can deduct from your income taxes, from your federal taxes. So it put a cap of $10,000 on your state and local tax deduction, what's known as the SALT. That's something that Congress and both of the candidates have talked about repealing that. Hasn't been necessarily repealed yet, but that's something that may be repealed in the near future because it really does hurt income taxpayers in high wealth states such as California and New York, because your state and local taxes tend to be much higher than they would be in other states. And so therefore, you're not allowed to go beyond the $10,000 deduction, even though you may be able to otherwise deduct $20,000 from your federal taxes. So deductions reduce the amount of tax that you owe in the federal income tax. And then we also have a series of what are called tax credits. Credits are different than deductions. Credits are much more powerful in that a credit comes off of your tax liability. So once you calculate your tax liability, then you subtract a tax credit from that. So if you have a child tax credit of $1,500, you owe $5,000, you subtract that $1,500 directly from the $5,000 you owe, you now only owe $3,500. That makes credits a much more powerful tool than simply a deduction. People like the income tax better because we have a graduated marginal income tax system. You don't pay all of your tax liability at your full income level, that you have these marginal tax brackets. So the first part of your income may be taxed at 10%, the second part taxed at 15%, and so on and so on. Then your third type of tax is sales taxes, which is a consumption-based tax. This is a benefits received principle. So you will pay taxation based upon the benefit you receive from purchasing and consuming some type of a commodity. There are two basic types of sales taxes. There are general sales taxes, and there are what are called selective excise sales taxes. General sales tax will apply to the vast majority of commodities that are transacted. Selective excise sales tax will only apply differently to different types of commodities. So you may have a tax on yachts that will be different than the tax that you have on some other type of a commodity. So those selective excise taxes are things such as sin taxes as well. So taxes on tobacco, taxes on alcohol, those sin taxes are also selective excise, because if you don't drink alcohol, if you don't smoke tobacco products, you're not buying those products, you are simply not paying the tax. So they're very favorable taxes in the eyes of voters because voters are able to shift the burden of taxation onto someone else. The more you can shift the burden onto someone else, the more likely you as a citizen are to like that form of taxation. But as we said, and sales taxes are the domain primarily of the state government. We also have local option sales taxes here in California. The income tax is primarily the domain of the state government. We don't have the type of local income taxes that you see in a lot of other states. And then it's also the domain of the federal government. This is where the vast majority of federal tax revenue comes from, is from the federal income tax. And as we said, the property tax is the primary domain of local governments. Then, as a result of Proposition 13, we saw a lot of these local governments move away from tax-based sources of revenue and start implementing more non-tax sources. So some non-tax sources of revenue you'll talk about in your future courses will be things like user charges and user fees. Now, a lot of local governments will kind of conflate user charges and user fees together, and will actually use those terms interchangeably. They're a little bit different. A user charge is usually associated with the consumption of some type of a service. So you'll be charged for the amount of electricity that you're using. You'll be charged for the amount of trash that's being collected. It's usually connected with the benefit of consuming some type of a service, and that's a user charge. Then there are user fees. User fees are usually not connected to the consumption of a service, but rather they'll be connected to the privilege of engaging in a certain type of behavior. So you want to get a driver's license, you pay a driver's license fee. You want to drive on the roads, you have to register your car and pay a registration fee. You want to hunt, you have to get a hunting license and pay a hunting fee. You want to open up a new business, you have to get a franchise license and pay a franchise fee. So usually it's linked up to the participating in some type of an activity. It not only allows government to collect revenue, it also allows government to regulate how that activity is being participated in through the issuing of these licenses. Now, for the typical local government in California, we have seen the typical government rely more on user fees and charges as opposed to traditional property taxes. Now, that's statewide average across California. Here in Southern California, local governments still tend to rely more on the property tax than they do other sources of revenue. So now that we've looked at expenditures and budgets, and we've looked at the revenue that pays for those expenditures, well, what happens when there's an imbalance between those revenues and those expenditures? When those expenditures are more than our revenues, that's where we end up with a deficit. A deficit is an imbalance between revenues and expenditures in one given fiscal year. Federal government has been running a deficit every single fiscal year since 1969, with the exception of 2 years. So in 1999 and 2000, the federal government was able to actually, at least on paper, have a budget surplus. Every other year, the federal government has run a deficit. Many states right now are staring right in the face of a deficit in the post-COVID era. As those COVID funds from the federal government have now expired and they've all now dried up, we are really starting to see the COVID-19 pandemic impacts on the economy. We thought we'd see them in 2021, but a lot of that federal COVID money masked those impacts. Now we're starting to see them in 2023 and 2024. If you run a deficit every single year, the accumulation of those deficits will then accumulate into long-term debt. But it's not just accumulated deficits that will result in long-term debt. Oftentimes, we'll issue long-term debt, as we've said before, for capital projects, so to build recreation centers and city halls. Long-term debt is referred to as a bond, and these bonds tend to be more than 1 year in maturity. Short-term debt will be money that governments borrow that matures in less than 1 year, and short-term debt is usually referred to as a note. So long-term debt is a bond, short-term debt is a note. Oops. So in terms of long-term debt, that is the primary way that local governments, public organizations will borrow money. There are different types of long-term bonds. One type of long-term bond that used to be the most common type is what's known as a general obligation bond, sometimes goes by the letters GO. A GO, a general obligation bond, is a bond that can be used for a variety of different purposes, but it pledges the full faith and credit of the government to repay that debt. So whenever the government borrows the money, the government with a general obligation bond is saying, we are going to guarantee to our investors that they will get their money back regardless of what we have to do. So if we have to raise tax rates, we will do it to repay the debt. If we have to sell off properties, we will do that to repay the debt. If we have to engage in reductions in force, we will do that. We will do whatever we have to do to repay the debt. And I know as an investor, there's a relationship between risk and reward. The lower the risk, the lower the reward. The higher the risk, the higher the reward. General obligation bonds are very low risk investments, which means that investors expect to get less interest paid on those debts. So local governments can issue general obligation bonds a lot cheaper at lower interest rates than they can other types of bonds. So if you're issuing this bond for a general purpose and you're going to use general tax proceeds to repay it, you can do a general obligation bond. Now, different states have different voter requirements. And there's actually an issue on the proposition on the ballot here in California next month that will authorize the issuance of general obligation bonds with only a 55% voter approval standard. Typically, general obligation bonds need to get 2/3 voter approval before they can go into effect. This proposition on the ballot says for bonds that are issued, general obligation bonds that are issued for housing, to provide housing, those will only need a 55% voter approval standard. So that's something we'll be voting on next month. Those are general obligation bonds. Then another type of bond is what's called a special revenue bond. A special revenue bond, if I can type, is a bond where the repayment is secured because of a special stream of revenue that's coming from a dedicated source. So say, for instance, you are going to put in streetlights in a neighborhood. The people who will benefit most from those streetlights in that neighborhood are people who live in the neighborhood because they drive those streets every single day. So you create an assessment district in that neighborhood and you assess them a higher tax rate in order to repay the debt that you've issued, the money you've borrowed to put those streetlights in. Then that money that comes in gets captured and then goes into the special revenue fund. And that special revenue fund then has that specific purpose for repaying that debt. That's a special revenue fund. It comes in from a special revenue source. Then you have what are called general debt service. I'm sorry, moving on to a different one. Then you have what are called double barrel bonds. I'm moving into something different now. So you have double barrel bonds. A third type of bond. A double barrel bond is a bond in which they share both of the features of revenue bonds as well as general obligation bonds. So in a double barrel bond, part of the feature will be general obligation, which will have a lower interest rate. Part of the bond will have a higher interest rate because it will be revenue in nature. These special revenue bonds mean that the money that's repaying the bond is coming from oftentimes the operation of something. So give you another example for a revenue type of bond. Let's assume that we're building a recreation center. That recreation center will generate revenue because we're going to charge people a fee to use that recreation center. We're going to collect the money from that fee, and then we're going to use the money from that fee to repay the debt. That would be a special revenue bond in that that money that is going to repay the debt comes from that special source of revenue. The government in a revenue type of bond does not have to guarantee its full faith and credit. It's saying we will repay the debt from this stream of revenue. Now, that stream of revenue does not materialize, then the investors don't get their money back. So there's a lot more risk with that type of a special revenue bond as opposed to a general obligation bond. When there's more risk, that means higher interest rates. So it's going to be much more costly in order for a government to issue a special revenue bond. A double barrel bond combines the two together. So you'll say 50% of the issue will be general obligation secured with full faith and credit of the city. 50% will be revenue, just secured with the revenue from this special revenue source. That double barrel bond will have an interest rate that is higher than general obligation, but will be lower than special revenue. So it kind of gives you that middle ground between the two worlds. You would use a double barrel bond if the amount of revenue that the facility is generating is not enough revenue to repay the debt. So if you don't have enough revenue to repay all the debt, then you can't use a revenue bond. You might want to use the double barrel bond and kind of combine the two together. You can partially repay the debt with the revenue, but the rest of repaying the debt has to come from more general obligation types of sources. So those are three different major types of bonds, ways in which local governments tend to borrow money. Now, there are other types of bonds like zero coupon and capital appreciation bonds that are even more speculative and even riskier. There are bonds called lease sales back bonds and lease revenue bonds and lease rental bonds and all kinds of different bonds. We don't get into in this class as a survey-oriented course, but you will get into when you move on into public budgeting and finance as other variations beyond these three. But for our purposes here, those are the three main types of bonds: general obligation, revenue bonds, and double barrel bonds. And that's typically how you borrow money as a local government. Not all debt is bad. Some debt is good. If you're borrowing money to pay for facilities that are needed by your citizens, that's a good use of debt. If you're borrowing money to balance your budget, that's not a good use of debt. So it really depends. It depends on how the debt is being used. The moral of the story with the budgeting process at the federal level is that budgeting is out of control. It's out of control in that we never get our budgets done on time, and we are never able to balance our revenues and expenditures. So throughout the years, we have tried several different attempts to reform the budgeting process. I'm not going to go through all the details with them here, but in the 1970s, there was the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. The purpose of the Budget and Impoundment Control Act was to try and control the budget process in Congress. So it did things like creating the budget committees in the House and the Senate, like we had talked about before. It created this idea of a budget resolution, like we've talked about before, to try and impose some fiscal discipline on spending of money in the process. It didn't work because after the Budget Impoundment Control Act was passed in 1974, fast forward into the mid 1980s, we are still not getting our budgets done on time, and we're still running deficits. So in the 1980s, we tried again. And the 1980s, when we tried again, we attempted to try and control deficits. So let's focus on one thing, and that's going to be deficits. So in an act called Graham-Rubin-Hollings, and then its sequel 2 years later, Graham-Rubin-Hollings 2, and those are the three gentlemen on the screen, Graham, Rubin, and Hollings, it was a bipartisan piece of legislation to establish maximum limitations on the amount of deficit that Congress could run in a given year. Then it created a timetable so that every subsequent year, that maximum allowable deficit would have to decrease until eventually, in the out years, the maximum allowable deficit would be zero, and we will have eliminated deficits. It didn't work. And it didn't work because, number one, it was unconstitutional. We won't get into that. But number two, it didn't work because Congress could always change those deficit targets. So if they were going to exceed a deficit target in 1987, they would just raise it and start over again. As long as Congress can change the rules are never going to work. And then in the 1990s, we tried again, but we said this time, instead of focusing on deficits, let's focus on spending. And that was done in the Budget and Enforcement Act. In the Budget and Enforcement Act, it set what we call firewalls between domestic, defense, and international spending. It said if you want to spend more money on domestic spending, you have to do that by finding another program to cut within domestic spending. You can't rob from domestic to pay for defense or vice versa. It also created something called PAYGO. And PAYGO is an acronym that stands for Pay As You Go. PAYGO required Congress that if it wanted to create a new program, it had to pay for that program. And it had to pay for that program by reducing spending in an existing program. So you couldn't just create a new program and say, here's poof, a brand new amount of spending that we're going to just pull out of thin air and spend more money. You have to pay for it somehow without borrowing money. And that was this process known as PAYGO. PAYGO is still something that the Senate is supposed to abide by today, but clearly we're now 50 years removed from the Budget Impoundment Control Act, 40 years removed from Graham-Rubin-Hollings, 30 years removed from the Budget Enforcement Act, and we are still not getting the budget done on time, and we are still not avoiding deficits. And the reason for that is getting the budget done on time and avoiding deficits is more a matter of having the political willpower to do it as opposed to the process in place. As long as members of Congress do not have the political willpower to make those difficult decisions of increasing taxes and or decreasing expenditures, you're just not going to be able to balance your budget. Also, partisan gerrymandering, not to make this a political science class, but partisan gerrymandering has created these safe districts in the House of Representatives and in state legislatures whereby members have become more ideologically extreme in that they know they're going to win the general election because they're a Republican in a safe Republican district, or they're a Democrat in a safe Democrat district. So instead, all they have to worry about is the primary election. Well, to win the primary election, the people who vote in the primary election are your members of the party who are much more ideological extreme than the mainstream of voters. So you have to appeal to those ideological extremes by making ideologically extreme decisions, which has pushed the Democrats into their corner, pushed the Republicans into their corner, and hollowed out the middle, making it much more difficult for us to come to budget agreements. And that's another reason why it is next to impossible today for us to get budgets done on time. But the bigger moral of the story here for budgeting is that we are always going to be faced with infinite demands, and we're always going to have to respond to those infinite demands with finite resources. In the wake of the loss of COVID-19 relief money, we have even more finite resources and even more infinite demands. So the future of budgeting is going to be even more complicated and difficult than it has been in the past. And I think over the next few years, we're going to continue to see the true impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that is a very quick overview of the management of financial resources, because how we manage our finances in government is one of the primary jobs that we do in public administration. But this is a class looking at contemporary public administration. And so it is incumbent upon us, even though this is not covered on our final assessment, to at least spend a couple minutes talking about some of the challenges that are associated with public administration now and into the future. So if you can just give me maybe 10 or 15 minutes to talk about some of these challenges. I've also provided you with some articles in our electronic reserve section of our Canvas class that kind of delve into these issues a little bit more in depth and look at these issues primarily from a public administration perspective, kind of looking at these issues from the perspective of how do we study these issues in public administration. So I think we're all familiar with many of these issues that we are dealing with in public administration, things such as remote telework, the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic and what it's meant for our organizations, how we manage diversity in our organizations, managing work-life balance for our employees, especially in the wake of COVID-19, and some of the technological challenges and opportunities that enhanced and sophisticated technology are presenting to us in the public sector. So in terms of some of the challenges of virtual remote work, I think we all lived through this in the COVID-19 pandemic. So most of us were working remotely. Many of us are still working remotely, at least for part of our positions. The federal government every year does a survey of federal employees. And one of the questions that they ask federal employees is they ask them, how much of your job is still virtual? How many days of the week do you work from home as opposed to going into the office? Over half of the federal workforce in 2024 reported that they were still working from home 3 or more days per week. So we still have a lot of virtual work going on out there. One of the challenges, obviously, with virtual telework is maintaining that work environment, maintaining that kind of esprit de corps that you would typically have in a physical work environment and maintaining that in a virtual type of setting. Another challenge is obviously regulating and monitoring the work that's being accomplished by people who are working remotely. Now, this has been a source of consternation for a lot of organizations. What a lot of organizations have found is that as they have told their employees, you need to come back to the physical work environment, employees have said, well, look at my performance appraisals throughout COVID. I have gotten excellent performance appraisals. I am accomplishing my work as well, if not better, than when I was in the office. So why can I not continue to work remotely? Now, when you move somebody from virtual work to physical work in a physical setting, you are changing their work condition. And if you don't have documentation of some performance reason for doing it, it becomes much more difficult to migrate people back to their physical work environment. I know at Long Beach, there's been a lot of pushback from staff to coming back on campus and making that very argument that the work I am doing at home, I have gotten good performance evaluations. It hasn't impacted my work. It's actually made my work even better. There's one article that I provided for you on our Canvas site by Melee. And Melee looks at, to kind of does a literature review of what articles in public administration have said about the impact of virtual work. And what the author found is that they looked at telework before the pandemic and telework after the pandemic to see what type of impact telework has had on things such as productivity. They say in terms of productivity, there's conflicting evidence. There are some studies that show productivity has gone up, some that show productivity has remained static, some showed that productivity has been hurt in some organizations. So they recommend there's more research that needs to be done about the impact of telework and productivity in organizations. However, where telework has been positive, according to most of the research, is it's had a positive impact upon employee job satisfaction. People tend to be more satisfied with their jobs after the pandemic than they were before the pandemic. More telework has also made them more resilient as employees, and it's also made them more autonomous. It's made them more accountable and more responsible, more willing to accept additional responsibilities and hold themselves responsible for getting the work done. So essentially what Melee says is the literature tells us that there's kind of a mixed bag, but a lot of the results are either kind of what they call null, that there's no impact, or are positive, with the exception then of productivity, which really depends upon the organization and the telework type of arrangement. The legacy of COVID-19 for public organizations, obviously the primary legacy is telework. And the primary legacy is you have much more fragmented work being done at different locations than what you have had in the past. The implication of that in terms of organization culture and organization harmony, I don't think we really know yet on a macro level. I think we all have anecdotal stories about how it has affected organization culture in our given organizations. But as the author tells us, there's still a lot more research that needs to be done, and it's a fertile field for future research in public administration. We know that one of our primary goals in public administration, one of our primary values is diversification and to create a representative bureaucracy where our bureaucracies, our organizations represent the citizens and the populations that they are serving. Diversity is a great advantage for organizations, but sometimes organizations continue to struggle with how to manage diversity. So I gave you another article to review, and this one is by Pandy. And the Pandy article looks at how the public administration literature has researched the management of diversity in public administration, and specifically looked at how public organizations have dealt with diversity in terms of race as well as gender. The recommendation from the author, just kind of make it to the point, is that the author says public administration research on race and gender and diversity needs to leverage what has already been done in other fields. So there are other fields, other disciplines that already have a robust history researching race and gender issues, such as sociology, to a degree, political science. And we cannot work as a vacuum in public administration. We need to reach out to those other disciplines and be willing to be multidisciplinary and use some of the findings that they have found in those other fields that have spent a lot more time working with these issues and studying these issues. Unfortunately, in public administration, when we conceptualize social equity, according to the author, we oftentimes do not focus on race and gender in that conceptualization of social equity. So they argue we need to expand our conceptualization of social equity. And one point of evidence that they use for it is they point to the ASPA Code of Conduct that we talked about when we talked about accountability and ethics. And they point to that social equity principle in the ASPA Code of Conduct, and they recommend that ASPA focuses more on race and gender in terms of their conceptualization of social equity. The work-life balance issue is another one that kind of intersects well with social equity, in that there's another article that I provided for you, and this one is by Shilpa, and it looks at work-life balance for public employees and what the literature tells us about attempts to properly balance work and life for our public administrators. What the author found, and I think this is really interesting, is that work-life balance initiatives, while very good and certainly worthwhile in organizations, oftentimes do not benefit every employee equally. And the author argues that the literature shows us that members from historically disadvantaged communities tend to not benefit as much from work-life programs as those from other populations. And that we have to keep in mind that the work-life balance is not the same for everyone. And different populations and different individuals will have different requirements for their work-life balance. But this work-life balance issue is something that we really struggle with now in the wake of COVID-19 and determining how much of a contribution does remote work make to that work-life balance. For some people, it's very important. It really frees them up to have a lot more flexibility in terms of childcare and things such as that. For others, it really doesn't. And for other employees, they may not enjoy remote work. And there may be other ways in which you can kind of find this work-life balance for those employees. So it really is a matter of taking a idiosyncratic type of an approach to each of our employees are different, each of our organizations are different in how we implement these programs for work-life balance. And then finally, technology and the future of public administration. We know that we are working in a much more complex environment than Woodrow Wilson was working in 1887. And our complex environment is primarily from the amount of information that we are swimming in on a daily basis. We are inundated with information, some from credible sources, some from non-credible sources. We need to be intelligent consumers of that information so we can know what information we should use and what information to use and how to use it in certain situations. We also, as you all know, are facing the AI challenge and the impact of artificial intelligence on public administration. This is a topic that you are going to talk about again and again throughout the MPA program. My take on artificial intelligence is that it is certainly the future of everything, including public administration. We are going to be leveraging artificial intelligence in a lot of the decision making that we do in public organizations, from forecasting the track of hurricanes to trying to forecast the changing demographics to writing the scenarios in terms of how these policies or these programs will have impacts upon our primary and secondary beneficiaries. Pretty much every decision we make in public administration can be augmented through the use of generative AI. Now, that doesn't mean generative AI will ever replace public administrators. That's not, I don't believe, and I hope that's never going to happen, but it is a very important tool. Hopefully, in the future, MPA programs will continue to embrace this role of artificial intelligence in public administration and will start incorporating it into their core and their elective courses. I know in my home program, we have not done a good job of that yet. We're still looking at the use of generative AI from the perspective of academic dishonesty. And I think that's a really limited way of looking at it. That's just one very, very, very small piece of the pie. I think we really need to think in a much more broad scale way about what generative AI is really going to mean to how we make decisions in public organizations in the future. And so I'm going to think we're going to see these curricula really start to morph in future MPA programs. And you'll probably see that morphing and that transition in the time that you are in this CSUN MPA program as well. I know we're almost at 9 o'clock. I know we went through all that very quickly, but the current issues discussion, that is not going to be on the final assessment. All that will be on the final assessment is up through managing human resources and managing fiscal resources. So that's all the information that we typically cover in this course. So we can then call Monday. No need for a Zoom session next Monday. You can use it to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, but you can also, if you want to or so disposed, use that time to work on Canvas essay number 8, and then also to work on your final assessment. I will post a reminder in our Canvas classroom that we won't need to have a Zoom session next Monday, just in case anyone forgets. I know we covered a lot of information tonight in these past 3 hours. I know we covered the information very, very quickly. It's kind of the nature of the beast in a course like this, but are there any observations, any clarifications, any questions in our last couple of minutes together tonight? Okay. If not, then I'm sorry, go ahead. Okay.
Professor, I just wanted to thank you for your guidance through this course. This has been my first course in college in 3 years. So it was a really nice way to ease back into it and also just really be informed. And I just really appreciate your guidance through this material.
Well, thank you, Sky. I really appreciate that, Skylar. And I know sometimes it's difficult when we come back into a graduate program after being out of college for a while. I know that it can be kind of challenging. And so hopefully, yeah, this does give you a good start to the MPA program, kind of introduce you to the types of issues that you'll be covering in the program. And, we are a survey-oriented course, and so we are a little different than the other courses that you'll be taking in the future. But at least it gives you kind of that foundational footing coming into the program, what types of issues you'll cover in your future courses. So thank you very much. Thank you for all the kind words. It's been a pleasure working with you. I've been very impressed with all of your work throughout the course. The grades, as I said, are way up here, which may not be the expectation in future courses. So don't get spoiled to it. But I think that it reflects the great work that everyone has done. And it's really been a pleasure working with you and talking with you every Monday evening. If you need anything at all from me, even though our class is going to be ending, I'm always available at my CSUN email, and so feel free to reach out to me if you ever have any clarifications in future courses or need guidance or advice or even recommendations in the future. I'm always available for you. So don't be a stranger and feel free to reach out. But wish everyone a great week. I wish everyone a great future in the program. And who knows, I may see you again in a future course. That's up to the powers that be, but I certainly hope I will see you in a future course. So thanks, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.